This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10. I've just noticed something that is potentially professionally injurious. It could almost amount to a form of professional suicide, as in career ending. I just looked at a story with the intention of possibly discussing it with you, and I found myself thinking a thought that I can't really afford to think when I do this for a living. Can you guess what it is? Can you imagine what that thought was? It's a front page story. You may already be aware of some of the details. It's linked to the Chris Kaba case, perhaps inevitably, given the constitution of our front pages this morning. And I found myself thinking, I don't know if I'm qualified to have any opinions on this. That's not a decision that I'd want to make. Crikey. And I sort of held that thought on one side of my brain. And on the other side of my brain, there's this sort of screaming banshee going, you have to have what are you talking about, you wet wipe? Every day you come on air with strong opinions. It's what we pay you for. And yet, I wouldn't want to make that decision. Police chiefs have formally asked the government to make it harder to investigate and prosecute officers after the fatal shooting of Chris Kaba. The feeling that the officer who shot him should not have been on trial at all is strong. It's enforced not only by the speed with which the jury threw the case out, but also, of course, by what subsequently emerged about Chris Kaba's background, which was about as grim as it's possible to imagine. He wasn't just a criminal, he was one of the worst criminals in the country. But of course that was not known to either the jury or to the police officer that killed him. So there it was. I literally found myself thinking, because I can see two arguments there. I worry that the emotional argument is that this man should never have been on trial. That does not compute, does it? That doesn't logically deliver the conclusion that it should be harder to put all police officers on trial. And the law is a nuanced and complicated organism. And sometimes it will do things that we are unhappy about. But it is generally considered to be the least bad option. So you can raise that possibility, raise that emotional sense. I feel very strongly that this police officer should not have been on trial. And if you were to grab that dial, if you were to tweak that knob intelligently or manipulatively, you might be able to turn me into a person who thinks that it should be harder to put police officers on trial at all. But it doesn't necessarily follow. And then, of course, the other argument becomes that this sounds like a bid for effective immunity. It could be described as cynical. If it involves emotional manipulation, it could be a cynical move to deliver impunity to police officers, which would in a way be bad for all of us. Not just hardened criminals endangering the lives of police officers and potentially civilians, and therefore being shot as a threat to life. I just mentioned that to you because I wanted to get it off my chest. It's a very weird feeling for me to have at 7 minutes past 10 in the morning. I don't know what I think about that. I'll tell you what, if this becomes commonplace, I'll have to find something else to do for a living. I'll have to try and get a job on one of the music stations. What's that? You say, I haven't got any opinions about that. Oh, no. Oh, I don't know. Oh, it's not for the likes of me. But I don't know. And that perhaps, I could go and work for the BBC, of course, although that ship may have sailed. I don't know. And the other thing I don't know, but I do have strong opinions on, and therefore the conversation that we will talk about is, as things stand, for me, I don't understand why I know his name. And I'm not going to say his name. It's a pathetic little gesture, really, isn't it? Considering that you probably know it. You probably got it on the tip of your tongue as we speak. It's on every front page of every newspaper except the Daily Star, which points out that Joe Biden appears to have borrowed Donald Trump's makeup palette and has turned it a slightly strange shade of orange. But every other front page is going to contain the name of the police officer who shot Chris Kaba. One newspaper tells us that the officer has a bounty of £10,000 on his head, and his name is the first two words of the second paragraph of that story. But I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to say his name. Or at least I'm going to try my very hardest not to say his name. Because here's the thing. I don't think we should know his name. And I understand the arguments that the judge made when he was contemplating or considering the decision to lift reporting restrictions on that name, or the request for anonymity. I understand that. I really do. But I think it was a terrible mistake. And I'm breaking one of my rules. Because one of my rules is that if we weren't in court, we weren't sitting on the jury or sitting in the public gallery or the press gallery every single day of the case, then we're not really qualified to comment on decisions that were made in court. But that covers an entire case. The decision to lift the anonymity of a individual known previously only as NX121 was essentially offered up as a defence of what we would describe as open justice. The judge, or rather the recorder of London, who is a judge but was not the judge in the case, rejected the application because he did not believe that there was a real and immediate risk to his life. And knowing what we now know about Chris Kaba's criminality and gang activity, then the decision seems to me to be ridiculous. It really does. I don't understand why we know his name. I haven't changed my mind about anything else. I think it was right that he went on trial, probably, because of the need for transparency. Something else I was very impressed by yesterday was the explanation that was offered up for why they did reveal details of the full details of Chris Kaba's criminality. And part of the reasoning was that it would minimise the likelihood of public disorder. I thought that was really interesting, and I worry sometimes that we report the wrong stuff. For example, on this programme yesterday, we carried a fascinating item on a whistleblower in HMP Wandsworth, describing to us what conditions in prisons are actually like. And yet most of the media today is more concerned with the brand of motor car that released prisoners were being picked up in outside the prison gates. And there are days when you despair of journalism. I'm not sitting in judgment on colleagues. I'm sure that if I was in charge of making decisions, I might have focused on the brand. But objectively, what's more important and more interesting is what a whistleblower is telling a journalist about what's actually going on behind the doors and behind the gates of a prison. Oh, someone got picked up in a Ferrari. It's ridiculous, right? But it is, for some reason, more interesting to us than other stuff. So I don't understand why we know his name, and I don't think we should have known his name. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's remarkable, incredibly naive of me, actually. What I took away from yesterday's programme, I took away two thoughts. The first was that two things can be true at the same time, and therefore the long and ugly history of both malfeasance and racism by police officers is a matter of historical fact. But it did not need to be relevant to this particular case, and it clearly wasn't, although some people are, I think, struggling to accept that. But what I was very naive about was thinking that any of that could possibly be parked. Why would the family not want the full details of his criminality to be released? Answer, I don't know, pride? Vanity, feelings, because the argument that it would minimise the likelihood of social disruption seemed to me to be incredibly powerful. You can't really, I don't think, take to the streets to protest about the killing of this man when you know who he was, when you know what he had done. It would not sustain claims that he was only shot because he was black. The details of the incident, the details of the event were considered by the jury and thrown out. The case was thrown out. But subsequently, the idea of people convening outside police stations, as we've seen before, I genuinely think that they played a blinder on that. I think they switched off that likelihood the minute they went public at 11 o'clock yesterday morning with Chris Kaba's criminal background. But I still don't know why I know his name, why I know the police officer's name. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. That why do we know his name? Well, and the second element of the conversation that I'd like to have, but I don't know if there'll be enough people listening to the programme who have the relevant experiences or the relevant knowledge. But does the likelihood of being prosecuted really have an impact on your willingness to do the job? 'Cause I'm not sure I believe that, oddly. I've heard politicians say it. I don't think I've heard any police officers who do the job say it. I think I've heard a couple of retired police officers say they wouldn't want to carry a gun. But you have to run the risk of being investigated for bad behaviour, whoever you are and whatever you do. It seems to me that if you're an armed police officer, then the quotes risk end quotes of being investigated for bad behaviour is more important than it is for almost anybody else in the country. And what job is more allied to matters of life and death than being an armed police officer? You know, and we know that police aren't infallible. In recent years, we've had that lesson driven home in a hideous fashion repeatedly. So that idea that the likelihood or the possibility of being prosecuted would make you less likely to want to do the job makes me wonder whether you would actually be the right person to do the job in the first place. So 10:15 is the time. It would anybody argue, and some days, not every day, obviously, because it would be about as professionally injurious as me not having an opinion on something. But some days we can be in complete agreement with each other. I'm not sure anybody would want to argue that we should know this police officer's name, unless I'm missing something. I mean, especially now we know that there is a bounty on his head, and the rationale given by the judge who decided to name him was that there was no real threat to him. Judge Mark Lucraft, the Recorder of London, rejected the application for anonymity, saying that it does not give rise to a real and immediate risk to his life. And before we knew the details of Chris Kaba's criminality, you could just about accept that, right? But now that you do, on what possible planet should this police officer have been named? All right? And then the second bit of the same question is whether or not, and this is where perhaps, the answer to the question of why he has been named begins to gather a little bit of momentum. But should an armed police officer be treated differently in law than anybody else? Because that is where the conversation started this morning. That's why I started, oddly, with that call for it to be made harder for armed police to be shielded from trials. Because I wondered whether this would happen. I can feel an opinion forming in the back of my head, having spent 15 minutes ago telling you I couldn't develop one at all. Because the idea that a police officer who shot someone gets treated differently from anybody else, there's something not quite right about that, isn't there? And that applies to the naming, not just to the being put on trial. So if you feel slightly uneasy about the idea of senior police officers using the emotional reaction to this case to shield officers in the future from scrutiny, from the legal process, to excuse them, if you like, from the legal process, because you don't think this copper should have been exposed to the legal process, you feel slightly uneasy about that, then are you the person to tell me why it was right that he was named? There's a lot to get through here. 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. I know this is the area of it that fascinates me, but it's an extraordinary story, and there'll be lots of things bubbling away in your mind. There'll be lots of thoughts that you've got, and I'm not sure that we'll spend the entire hour zoned in exclusively on this question, but that's where I'd like to start. I'd like to start with the question of why on earth his anonymity was lifted and whether or not we think it should have been, because I'm pretty close to 100% certain that I think the judge responsible for making that decision has made an almighty error. An almighty error. But of course I could be wrong. It's 10:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 10 is the time. So the reason I was naive yesterday was when I read you the front page of the Times about and described anger on both sides at the way in which the prosecution of the police officer who shot Chris Kaba had been pursued and at the verdict that the jury had reached. And I thought that anger would dissipate, not least with the revelations about Kaba's background that came out after 11 o'clock. I was completely wrong about that. I'm not even sure why. But the question of why on earth this police officer was named is the one that I want to start with today. Justin is in Hertford. Justin, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First-time caller. Loved your book.
Thank you, mate. Gosh. Welcome.
Love the show. Don't always agree with you, but this one really has got me riled up. My brother was a police officer for 30 years. Number of the years, he never firearms trained. But he was a traffic officer and was involved in an incident and a pursuit. Immediately suspended because of the nature of the pursuit.
Okay.
And he had probably 4 to 6 weeks where he was suspended pending prosecution for driving without due care.
Yes.
Suffice to say, it all dissipated away and he was reinstated. But it had a massive impact on his, on the way he then policed going forward. And I just am in disbelief. I don't understand the reason why this police officer's name has been released. I mean, I can't begin to imagine what he's been through in the last 2 years. I saw my brother for 6 weeks. The stress and worry that his career could be over in fulfilling his job. But
he does have to prove that, doesn't he? And I mean, the process that was triggered by the event that he was involved in needs to happen, doesn't it?
What, the process of the investigation,
yes,
or the CPS being involved?
Well, either.
Well, I think
the CPS have to be involved.
Well, yeah,
but they don't have to. They don't have to conclude that the case is going to court. But in your brother's case, you're not suggesting that it shouldn't have been investigated.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I think the point I'm trying to make is the difference with my brother is, this guy was suspended pending a murder investigation. So this guy for 2 years sits at home, suspended from work, not knowing if he's going to be convicted for murder, not knowing if he's going to go inside. I think now we've all seen the footage and the other stuff that's come out, but just let's go with the footage. Why?
Yeah, we have to. The other stuff that's come out is I mean, it's almost impossible to detach it from the thinking about the case, but it is absolutely detached from the what the jury and indeed what the judge and the police officer that night would have known and would have done.
Sure, but 2 years ago, James, you and I sit there, you're the CPS, I'm the, however this process works, we know the facts, we know the individual, we look at the footage. Why on earth was a choice?
You're moving into a different conversation, closer to the one we had yesterday about whether or not it should have come to trial at all. And we might well disagree about that. I think the importance of seeing justice being seen to be done is paramount. I'm not quite as certain as I was yesterday. But on the question of why he was named, there's no wiggle room. I mean, neither of us can see a scintilla of a reason why why we know his name.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to now, in the world we live in today, with social media, how easy it is to identify.
That's a really good point, actually.
You have to protect police officers.
That's a really good point. And sometimes it can sound a bit throwaway about the social media this and social media that, but the world has changed. The world has changed since the judge who made this decision was at law school. And I would say the world has changed in the last 10 years on things like anonymity, given the nature of social media. The likelihood of keeping the identity of somebody secret is probably close to zero. On the other hand, the way that it spreads all around the world and things like a bounty for the address cuts the other way. So actually, the more you think about it, the more you wonder whether the social media argument works on both sides of the cloud. How can you possibly keep it secret in days of social media? The wrong name may get out there. Thank you, Justin. Kim's in Manchester. Kim, what do you think?
Hiya. Thank you so much for this topic and everything you shared so far. It's actually really hit home to me. The actual criminal himself is known as a gang member. Whether or not that was known to the judge or not it doesn't really matter at this point, because I believe that the judge made the decision to not protect.
There's two judges. There's the judge in the case. I mean, everybody would have known his background, even the lawyers, the defence and the prosecution, because the prosecution sought to include it. The defence rather sought to include his Kaba's background in the case. But there's two judges. I should probably clarify that. The judge that sat at the Old Bailey is not the judge who made the decision to refuse an anonymity order. But they all would have known. Everybody would have known. Yeah. Chris Kaba's background. Yeah,
so I'm referring to that other judge then.
The recorder of London, Judge Mark Lucraft.
Yeah, so unfortunately this guy has put a police officer in a huge risk. And I know that you commented that this judge may have been educated quite a long time ago. Things have changed in the last 10 years. But what hasn't changed in the last 10 years is gang violence. And gang violence, since we can go back 30 years, gang violence is such a huge issue. And regardless of whether it would happen now or then, it's a huge possibility that they would have found him regardless. And if this guy
you afford protection. So if I don't know, one of the Cray twins' henchmen had been shot by the police and that officer had gone on trial, you would try to keep his identity secret because of the possibility of repercussions.
Absolutely. If he has a family, these people will find out where you live, they will find out who your family are, and they will make things extremely difficult for you as an individual. This man's life could be at risk now.
Well, I think I see it like you do, but as always on this programme, I'm getting some very clever texts. So Ben in Bradford says, keeping the officer's name a secret is no good. It's actually good it's come out into the open because it keeps him safer. Sam says, of course the judge did the right thing by lifting his anonymity. The police are not above the law and need to be reminded of that, because when they think they are, you end up with firearms officers like David Carrick committing the crimes that he committed. Perhaps if they were more honest and less racist, we could give them more credit and more benefit of the doubt. But until then...
We're not talking about race here. We're not talking about race. We're talking about...
We're not.
No,
we're not. But a lot of other people are. I mean, on both sides of whether you approve or disapprove of racism, a lot of people who approve of racism are trying to pretend that people who disapprove of racism are going to be upset by this, by the revelations about Chris Kaba, or are going to be unhappy about what's happened. And a lot of people who disapprove of racism think this is proof that the police are racist. I, for the record, completely reject that analysis, but I'm conscious that I'm white and I don't therefore get treated differently by the police, but I don't think Chris Kaba was. But the benefit of the doubt to a white officer shooting a black man is about race, unfortunately. And the history of racism in the Metropolitan Police is pertinent to the point being made by this texter, by Sam.
I appreciate that, but I think from my perspective right now, I'm just looking at two men, one of them being in a gang and one of them being a police officer. And when I look at it from that standpoint, I just worry that this man's life could be at risk. And he, by the way, if he needs to be prosecuted, if we didn't know about the case, fine, absolutely. But I just think that when we look at criminals in general as well who murder, etc., it's the police, it's the actual police who make the decision to release that. It's not, like, that doesn't have to be released.
So just again, I don't know that anyone, I'm going to read the text I get until I get a caller telling me why it was right to release the fella's name, but I can't see it. You can't see it. I correct you on one thing, if I may. Chris Kaba was not shot because he was a gangster. He was not shot because he was a criminal. Because of his criminal past. He was shot because he posed an immediate threat to the lives of the police officer's colleagues, who in that moment believed that 2-ton Audi was likely to kill one of his colleagues if Chris Kaba continued to drive it in the way that he was driving it. So even if it had been your mum in that car doing that thing, the police officer would have made the same decision and shot your mum. That is the point, and that's why I don't think it has got anything to do with race. But I'm clearly conscious of the belief that many people will have, that he would not have been shot if he was black. Someone sent me a comparison with Raoul Moat overnight, which I just found bizarre, I have to be honest with you. Because if Raoul Moat had come out posing a threat to the life of the police officers that were negotiating when he was holed up in the woods, then he would have been shot as well. I think that's pretty obvious. But again, I'm conscious of not having lived my entire life knowing that I can't trust the police because of my skin colour. 10:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Yeah, I'd like to say we were close to unanimity. I think we are, but I can't be sure. John, for example, writes, all accused should be treated exactly the same. Otherwise, it's not a fair system. You can't have one rule for one kind of accused and another rule for other kinds of accused. Well, except there are two different kinds of accused, aren't there? I suppose all people charged with murder are going to run the risk of repercussions from the victim's family, the victim's friends. Even previously law-abiding people would be tempted to vengeance. So if you start using that as a grounds for affording anonymity, then where does it end? Answer, perhaps it ends with the people who were likely to seek vengeance for a hardened criminal. And that wouldn't involve many people who end up on trial for murder. But would you give a gang member who was accused of murdering another gang member, would you give them anonymity? Because their identity might lead to bounties being placed on their head. So you see, I can see why it's not straightforward, but I'm struck by how few of us, how few people contributing to the conversation can understand why this officer was named in the first place. This person can, and they are in professional standards, rubber healers, as I referred to them yesterday, somewhat ignorantly, but that's two serving professional standards officers in 2 days contributing to the programme. If you read this out, could you leave my name out? Of course I can. I'm a serving officer working in PSD. I investigate misconduct and crime committed by other officers. I am willing to accept the assessment of the judge regarding the naming of the officer post-charge. We have to accept that other defendants in other murder trials may also face potential risks. I know it's not today's topic, but I don't think he should have been named because he shouldn't have been charged, but post-charge, naming him is different. It will be interesting to see now whether the IOPC still insist on putting the officer through misconduct proceedings. Indeed it will. John is in Manchester. John, what made you pick up the phone?
I just wanted to draw two things to your attention, if that's okay. The first being that I won't name the media outlets, but I find it highly surprising that there are some media outlets that went to the judge demanding for this officer's name to be released, but now the same media outlets are also saying that they are outraged at the fact that this officer was named. So I roll my eyes at that.
Are you sure they are? I mean, generally speaking, the media acts as one in these kind of cases and always apply for anonymity orders to be lifted. And I don't see the wringing of hands might be coming from columnists or opinion writers, but I don't think the news desks that wanted the anonymity order lifted are quite well, I don't think they are engaging in the sort of hypocrisy that you're describing. But I may sound to you as if I'm splitting hairs. I'm not sure.
I'd have to name the outlets, otherwise I won't continue down that line. But
you can if you want. The BBC were involved, the Times were involved, lots. I mean, as I say, generally speaking, in these cases, the media acts as one.
Sure. I suppose my main, more important topic that I'd like to call it quickly, because it might take a bit more time, is that you had an officer on yesterday that was trying to provide examples of why officers should be assessed differently to the members of the public. So here's why that should take place.
Are you a police officer?
I'll try and keep that anonymous if I can, if you don't mind. So we've got we currently have, under the Road Traffic Act, legislation that recognises the training standards of officers that drive to a different level than normal members of the public. So if there's, say, a pursuit that takes place and a crash happens, it used to be the case that the IOPC and the CPS would assess the police driver, at a normal member of the public's level. They now no longer do that because it was leading to police officers getting charged for dangerous driving, as an example.
Okay, I'll take your word for that. So, I mean, obviously, in pursuit, you would excuse things that you would not pursue, that you would not excuse not in pursuit. You both excuse and expect. I think that's what you're telling me. I wasn't aware of that, and I think I understand where you're going with it. So, carry on.
So the new legislation now requires the CPS and the IPC to assess the police driver on the training they have received, and they are assessed at the standard at the level of their driving. So I think it's fair, therefore, to say that we already do this in other areas of law. We acknowledge that the training that police officers have in their driving ability far outweighs a normal traditional members of the public, because we expect them to drive at very high speeds in challenging circumstances. So therefore, I think that it is
I'm uncomfortable
absolutely.
with this. I think. So what you're saying is because these officers. Not in the context of driving. I don't see that. I don't think the link is as clear as you do. That's all. I don't think that because you've had because the. But chasing a criminal in a car is going to obviously involve driving in a way that would, in other circumstances, involve breaking the law.
No, it's not, because that's the whole. Well, it's not, because the whole point. Well, for the offender, it may be, but not for the police driver.
No. If I'm chasing you and you're speeding and I want to catch you, I have to speed. So to prosecute me for speeding would be silly.
But that's why it's now recognised in legislation.
Yeah, and I see that in the context of driving. I don't see it in the context of shooting people.
Because.
I mean, again, you're not contributing to.
It's not lawful. It's not lawful for a criminal to go around with a gun, is it? But it is lawful for a police officer to go around with a gun.
Yes, but it's not lawful for the police officer with the gun to murder people.
It's not, but that's not what we're saying here. What we're saying
it's what he was charged with, John.
But what I'm trying to draw the distinction on is that, is it right to recognise that the training that a firearms officer receives far outweighs the general working knowledge of, and it's not the members of the public's fault for not understanding the day-to-day workings and how armed policing works.
No, you can't argue this. You can't argue because I'm an armed police officer. I shouldn't be subject to the law.
That's not what I'm saying.
It is.
That's not what I'm saying.
Because I've had all the training. I shouldn't be subject to the same laws that the rest of the country abides by. To be fair, you're not contributing to the conversation about whether or not the officer should have been named. I presume you think he shouldn't have been.
Correct.
And then you go further and don't think he should have been on trial at all, which I can understand. And then you go further and sort of argue that people like him should never be on trial ever.
That's not what I've said.
So when then?
What I'm saying, at the point of which, that if the assessment that is being made by the IOPC or CPS clearly defines that an officer goes outside of their training that they have received, at that point they should be looked to be prosecuted. If they are operating inside the training that has been provided to them, that doesn't.
That's why I was interested in what your background was, because it may be relevant and it may help me to understand where you're coming from. But it's perfectly within your rights, given the conversation that we're having, for you not to say so. But I don't care how much training you've had. If the CPS decides that there's a case of murder to answer, then you go to court. That's what the CPS is for. You can't, as a police officer, if indeed you are one, you can't be claiming that you get to override the processes of the CPS because your training is so good. That's just silly, John. Mike's in Plymouth. Mike, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James.
Hello,
Mike. I'm a former police officer and I was a firearms commander for 5 years, so I haven't carried a firearm in the police, but I was the equivalent of the person in this case who would have authorised officers to deploy and draw and use firearms tactics in this scenario. So that's something I've done. But on your first point about anonymity, I completely agree that he shouldn't have been named.
Do you know why he was? I mean, in your own words or with your own experiences, can you, if you had to explain why he was, what would you say?
I can only assume that the judge has made a huge error, an element of naivety, because I think the information that we now obviously has come to light is that there was credible information around the background of Chris Kaba and threats that were received at the time. There is a protocol, and this is one of the issues I think firearms officers would have had at the time, is there is a protocol that is generally observed for them, that the assumption is that they are given their code name and anonymity is not guaranteed, but it is has always been the case. And I think this is the first time, one of the few times an officer has been named. And I think the reason for that, in say a case of a normal officer who runs somebody over in a vehicle or something like that, I think because firearms officers are, the nature of their job, they are being asked potentially to use lethal force. So I think in terms of separating them slightly from other police officers, that is the process that has been there. And I think, one of the issues then, it starts to erode confidence of serving firearms officers as to what is likely to happen to them. Because, I've been, it's a different subject for a different day, but I've been involved with the IOPC on the end of an investigation, not for firearms, but for use of force. And it is not a pleasant place to be. And my own case doesn't
of course,
comparison
but
with this
still,
officer.
the principles and the processes you can make comparisons with. So we forget sometimes, don't we, about the fallibility of humans when we're discussing things like this, whether it's somebody in uniform, whether it's police officers, or whether it's someone in robes, whether it's judges. And doctors, we do it with doctors as well. They make mistakes. They get things wrong. It's not that you have to be corrupt or malign or malevolent, but he might have looked at all the evidence and be 51-49. It might have been like Boris Johnson writing his bloody Brexit columns. He might have written two, one in favour and one against, and he's come down on the wrong side and said, let's lift the anonymity.
Indeed, and it may be nothing more than that. Not realising the seriousness potentially of the situation. I am merely speculating, but I think as we now see the decision, and hopefully this will kind of help redress the balance, because I think what firearms officers will probably want is confidence that this doesn't become the norm, that they are named. Because again, if we get into the area of why they may be reluctant to carry a firearm, that will contribute.
Do you think so? Do you think, because no police officer in England and Wales has ever been convicted of murder. The police officers who have been convicted of murder had been thrown out of the force by the time their case came to court. So that's why that sentence can be a little bit confusing for some people. Nobody in the police service in England and Wales has ever been convicted of murder. Do you think, and given your background, I'd be fascinated in your answer to this question. Do you think this will perturb people, not necessarily from shooting if they're in the job, but from taking the gun, from actually going into that branch of the police service?
Yes, I would believe so.
Right.
On the basis that you can be a police officer, you can be a neighbourhood officer, and you're not going to put yourself anywhere near this level of threat and risk. And you're absolutely right, no officer has been convicted of murder, but do you want to run the risk of potentially being the first one, or even having to go through that process? I can't even imagine what that officer would have had to go through for the last 2 years.
No, nor can I. I mean, everyone keeps talking about how cool he was in court and stuff, but that you don't know what was going on in his head or at home or in his heart.
Absolutely.
I mean, and would he feel betrayed, do you think, the very fact that it came to court? So
moving on to your second question,
yes,
really.
Please.
So as a firearms commander, I was a person who asked firearms officers to go to these scenarios, to stop these vehicles, and to utilise the tactics that they have been trained to do so. So I'm the sort of person who's potentially putting them in the scenario that this officer found himself in. So I think I in terms of immunity from prosecution, I don't agree with that.
No,
I think that these things absolutely have.
But even
to
if
be
you use the defence training, then you at some point you're going to end up in court proving that what you did abided with your. We can't just take your word for it, can we?
No, absolutely. So any use of force by police should be investigated. I think the difficulty for me, having reflected on this case, is the situation where you have firearms officers who, so they have broadly, from what I know of this and what we now know, obviously through the trial, those officers have implemented approved, authorised tactics that they would have been trained to do so. They've then been met with the resistance, the force, the potential of the vehicle becoming a weapon. And in line with his training, this officer has acted with his honestly held belief. So I think that the issue then is for officers to be in this situation where they're utilising their tactics and their training broadly in line with what they've been taught to do so. They've been authorised to do so by a commander. To then find yourself not only under investigation, but in a scenario where doing that can put you in court for murder.
Yes.
Again, if we talk about firearms officers wanting to carry a firearm, it's definitely going to make them reluctant to do so. So for me, when I heard about this case, I didn't have any more information but I anticipated for there to be a charge of murder.
Yes.
This officer must have stepped. There must have been something in this incident that stepped way beyond training. Something really left field.
Yes.
Whereas when that didn't come out, I was as confused as many other people as how it ended up as a murder charge. Notwithstanding, it should be investigated, absolutely.
But not to have arrived in the dock at the Old Bailey. You see, you're fascinating, and thank you for being so clear and articulate as well, because that is the point, and that's where the sort of, I don't know what the word is, the thinking behind this decision gets quite murky, doesn't it? Because you know that the reasoning behind revealing Chris Kaba's background was to diffuse potential public unrest. And if I was a police officer, I'd wonder whether the decision to prosecute this officer might also have been informed by a desire to diffuse public unrest, especially when I read that in the first days of the trial, the jury asked for clarification on what unlawful killing meant. And once that was provided to the jury, the likelihood of a guilty verdict became close to zero, I think.
Yes, and I think I think also within this, we can't lose sight of the fact that policing more broadly has lost trust and confidence in recent years.
Yes,
and that that may have contributed to the kind of desire and the push for that anonymity.
Again, you're putting it better than I am. It's a good job there's no job swaps around, although I'd be rubbish at your job, your old job. I think we can both agree on that. So there are other factors. There's a lot of moving parts in a case like this. Yes,
I think, there's the broader politics at play, and I think, the fact that when you talk about the Carricks and the Cousins of this world,
yes,
they were we can't get away from the fact they were firearms officers. So there's an undercurrent of feeling and views that feed into this and may have pushed that
for good or for ill. And that's a conversation for another day. Is there someone at the door, Mike?
No, sorry, it was just my iPad.
Thank you. That was so powerful and helpful to me. It changes some of the things that I was thinking at 11 o'clock yesterday. You'll remember we came straight off the lifting of reporting restrictions on Chris Kaba's background into discussing it. And I said to you at the time that this is not a moment for absolute certainty, but Mike makes some brilliant points. It's 10 to 11.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:53 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where, I mean, next to nobody, I think, apart from some texts, have so far managed to explain why Judge Mark Lucraft was right to reject the police marksman's application for anonymity. But there's still time. And indeed, Philo is in Shaftesbury. Philo, what made you pick up the phone?
Morning, James.
Hello.
I picked up the phone because I don't have the same view as you on this, and
Good.
I think that he made exactly the right decision. My principal reason is that we have a system of open justice in England and Wales.
Yes.
And everybody on trial for an offence, such as an offence of murder, unless they are under the age of 18, will be named as part of that process of open justice.
So there is no
there
are no grounds for exemption.
Well, there are. I mean, national security could be one. But in this case, the fear, and I've no doubt there was a reasonable fear for the safety of the officer, that wouldn't be found to be sufficient to override the principle of open justice.
Yeah.
And had the officer been convicted, thankfully he wasn't, he would undoubtedly have been named.
Of course, and no one would have a problem with that.
No, but it's not always the case, James, because if you take a child, and this happened recently, earlier this year, a couple of children were convicted of murdering a 19-year-old man in a park in Wolverhampton, I believe, and they had anonymity because of their age.
Yes.
And even when they were convicted, the judge rejected an application for their...
Yeah, that's right. It was rare,
to
actually.
To lose their anonymity. I mean, there are a number of reasons for that. But, I mean, I think, and I think one of your callers said a while back, that in a funny sort of counterfactual way, naming him could actually make him safer than he would be if he wasn't named.
Why? I hope so.
Because I think maybe there would be more in place to protect him. But I mean, and I'm not.
Because there's no way that the name wouldn't have got into the hands of
those who wanted to do him harm,
Precisely.
even in the face of an anonymity order, would have been able to find out his identity and where he lived.
Yes.
So,
yes, but I think you're right. I think. Oh, I don't know if you're right. I think the second bit that you said is right. But for me, I'm wondering whether this is actually an emotional response to the story, because I'm thinking not yours, mine. No. I'm thinking it's not fair that I know his name. It's not fair that the people his kids go to school with know who he is. It's not fair. But all of this hinges on the idea, which I rejected out of hand yesterday, that he shouldn't have gone to trial at all.
Well, that's an interesting point, James, because that also...
First time for everything, Philo.
It is interesting, but dare I say it, wrong.
Yes.
Because, the CPS would have made the decision applying the test for a prosecution to charge him. It ended up in court. Now, if the evidence had been weak, really weak...
Yes.
And even if it was maybe not really weak, but weakish, any defence lawyer acting for that officer after the conclusion of the prosecution case would have made a submission of no case to answer to the judge in the absence of the jury.
Right.
And the test that the judge would be applying is, could any jury properly directed on this evidence convict? And if the answer to that was no, then the case would have been thrown out at what we lawyers call half-time.
So it goes through...
it
goes up. It goes up.
To the jury.
Yeah.
But interestingly...
this is so interesting.
But interestingly, the prosecution tried to add a charge of manslaughter. Obviously, that's lesser culpability than murder.
Yes.
And the judge rejected that. So that's a very pro-defendant. Obviously he's on trial for murder, but the judge wasn't allowing a lesser charge to be put to the jury. It was murder or not.
That's really...
And also, I think your caller just before the break, John, I think he might have been confusing a couple of things on anonymity, because there is a difference between the defendant, who happens to be a firearms officer, and his anonymity, and a witness who happens to be a firearms officer. And there probably would have been firearms officers giving evidence this trial. I don't know.
No, there were several who repeatedly said that they would have done exactly the same thing in the same circumstances.
But their anonymity would have been protected. They would have been known as MX10 or whatever.
Got it.
And they probably would have been screened or whatever. There's a difference.
Yes, of course.
Because there is a difference.
I'm glad you mentioned him. I think I think you're right, he was confused, but I think I was a little bit impatient with him, because I think the point he was driving towards was the point that was then made very powerfully by Mike, who used to be a commander of armed police officers, about the relationship between training and consequences. And Neil Basu, of whom I'm a big admirer, former head of counter-terrorism, has made a similar point this morning about the crisis of confidence amongst armed policing. But you, as a former lawyer, or as a lawyer, retired lawyer, are supremely comfortable with the naming of the officer for reasons that you've
I wouldn't put supremely, because that detracts from. I empathise with the man.
Got it. No, okay, yes, yes, you feel for him, but the law needs to be
justified in legal terms.
Yeah,
certainly
there
don't
we go.
think the judge made a mistake. Don't think the judge made a mistake.
And there it is. We've gone.
It's a vindication. The whole thing is a vindication. And we don't get many of these of our jury system, James.
That's what I was saying yesterday, actually.
I was just in 3 hours.
Yes, I was just beginning to doubt that after some of the earlier callers, and you've restored some of my faith in the opinion that I held yesterday. It's a great vindication of jury. Yes,
that's without, again, perfectly correct legal reasons, knowing anything about Chris Kaba's background.
Exactly that, precisely. Can I run something else by you?
Yeah.
While you're here, I'll be a little late for the news, but people are used to that by now. I'm going to read this out. It's aggressively phrased and unnecessarily so, but that's how Iris has chose to express herself. When are you going to have the courage to admit that this was all caused by the rampant fear by all in the public of being called racist? I firmly believe that had he been white, none of this would have happened. Of course, the corollary of that argument is that because there is a long history of racism in the Metropolitan Police Service, there is a sort of conscious or subconscious requirement to prove that this is not yet more evidence of that. So whether you're coming at it from the sensible and informed perspective that I've just articulated, or whether you're coming at it from the why can't we all be racist anymore, like Iris is, would that have been part of the process, part of the thought process at any point?
I don't think that would have operated subconsciously or consciously on the mind of the judge in the case.
But on the mind of the CPS to refer it upwards?
I don't know. I wouldn't like to say, because these people do. That's a public service. They do important work. They don't get paid very much, James.
No,
and it's
relatively speaking. The reason I ask is because I was so, for want of a better word, impressed by the reasoning behind the decision to release full details of Chris Kaba's criminality and the abiding motivation being the desire to minimise the likelihood of public disorder and disruption. I just wondered whether they'd have taken something similar into account when deciding to pursue the prosecution.
I don't think so. But James, that decision, I understand the quelling the risk of public disorder, but I feel slightly queasy about it because does it mean, or is any of the motivation that a person who happens to have a violent background, but that background wasn't known to the relevant officer, do they deserve to be treated in any lesser way than anybody else?
No, I take your point, and again, it's all about the law being absolutely clear and unbiased, or justice needs to be blind, for want of a better word. But that was just part of the reasoning, and I don't know what the case would have been for allowing those reporting restrictions to have remained in place. And the reason why it had to be considered was because the family had requested it. I imagine it would have been rejected even without the threat of public disorder. I was just impressed by them showing their workings on that occasion, in the same way as you're right to remind us that the whole story, as I think we kind of concluded yesterday, is a vindication of the criminal justice system, up to and including trial by jury. None of which, and I think Philo really nailed this, none of which makes you feel any less sorry for the poor man in the dock. And the question of whether or not he should be named has now been properly explored. I wonder whether you've changed your mind.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 7 minutes after 11, and I know I do this quite a lot, but I'm going to do it again. In fact, Dave has put it brilliantly. He goes, where in the cosmos do you get such a high calibre of callers? And that's true every day, but my goodness me, it was particularly true in the last hour. I mean, truly extraordinary at times, because it's a heck of a lot more complicated than perhaps any of us realised at first glance, the story of Chris Kaba's killing, and not necessarily for the reasons that we thought it might be. But there are always people who think things are simple. Let me read you this from Peter, who I think, despite the seriousness of the subject matter, I think probably will get dropped into Idiot's Corner. So Peter writes, it's very simple. As a general rule, any text I get that begins with the words, look, it's very simple, goes on to be an absolutely extraordinary display of ignorance and failure to appreciate complexity. And here's Peter. Look, it's very simple. Do as you're told when the police tell you, and then you won't get shot at. No. I believe that's the attitude that Sarah Everard adopted when she was stopped in public by a police officer, Peter, isn't it? So you might want to think... that through next time you tell people to obey police officers, regardless of whatever it is they are telling them to do and wherever it is that they are doing it, you silly sausage. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. So, I listen, I can sound so po-faced sometimes. I don't care what car a released prisoner is being picked up in. I do care about what happens next. And there's an extraordinary juxtaposition of stories in the Guardian newspaper today, because it's by no means the cheaper prints or the shallower end of the media that's focusing on the identity. I mean, they don't go in big on what the car is, but there's what I believe is a Bentley in the background of one photograph showing a recently released prisoner who's been let out after 7 years for kidnap and GBH. But the story below the photograph is the one that I think, if we could sort of... what would you describe it as? If we could assemble an objectivity machine Utilitarianism, if we could bring some form of utilitarianism to journalism and actually set our hierarchy of stories, the hierarchy of importance of stories. No, the hierarchy of size of stories could be tethered to an objective analysis of what is most important. How different do you think the news would look? It's extraordinary, right? Because the fundamental point I'm trying to make is the difference between the public interest and what the public find interesting. Because it is, trust me on this, it's what I do for a living. It really is not the same thing. And yet sometimes I think we fall into the trap of thinking that it is. What the public finds interesting and what is in the public interest are oceans apart, quite often, truly oceans apart. I think the public probably is more interested in stories about prisoners being released early, being picked up in Bentleys, than they are in stories about what happens to the prisoners when they are released early and don't have any money. But that is going to be the factor that contributes most to the very high rate of recall that Shabana Bahmood talked about yesterday, the Justice Secretary. The proportion of people being released early from prison and then being recalled is very high. Objectively, what we're looking at is the difference, if you like, between now and then. So even if these prisoners were not being released early, I suspect the rates of recall would be similarly high. I don't think that the fact that they're coming out early, or earlier than they otherwise would do, I don't think that that is remotely relevant to the rate of, well, it's probably relevant a bit, but I think rates of recall are perilously high in this country anyway. But that won't stop the media trying to add 2 and 2 together and come up with 5. The figures won't be available yet, but when they come out, you can guarantee that they will be jumped on and quite possibly not reported with reference to what would have been happening previously, just as the early release scheme itself is being reported as if it was invented by Keir Starmer instead of something that became inevitable as a consequence of Conservative Party policy. Or I mean, Alex Chalk this morning, I think I might have exercised the curse of O'Brien yesterday. Every time I say something nice about a Tory, they come along and undo it. Or he was trying to blame it, I think, earlier entirely on the pandemic, this sort of logjam in the criminal justice system, which displays either a willful ignorance or an extraordinary naivety about what state the criminal justice system was in before the pandemic came along, up to and including the physical state of our courts. Not to mention that the morale of our barristers, especially in the legal aid sector. So another 1,100 criminals were released yesterday, serving sentences of 5 years or more in order to ease the crisis. She wants this to be the last emergency release. My information is that that's quite optimistic. That's quite an ambitious aim, given the numbers, given the simple arithmetic involved. And the figure that the BBC put to her, and she didn't reject it, it could be as high as 50%. So here's a tragedy of our time, okay? Given that so much of our media is still, despite the absurdity of Liz Truss, despite the catastrophe of Brexit, despite the depravity of Boris Johnson, much of our media is still in thrall to whatever is left of the Tory party. It's incredible. And of course, you can't get very enthusiastic about what's left of the Tory party anymore. So instead, they become vicious in their pursuit of the Labour government, up to and including attacking them for not breaking the rules when the Tories who did break the rules were excused and exonerated at every turn. But what this does to the public, the tragedy of this nature of journalism, the tragedy here is that we will be encouraged to focus on the wrong thing. And I can almost guarantee to you, I could probably name the people that will encourage you to focus on the wrong thing. So when these rates of recall come out, it will be used as bogus evidence that the Labour government has done something wrong, right? That they shouldn't have been released early at all. I'm not going to mention what rates of recall were previously. I'm just going to tell you it's 50% of the people that have been released early have been recalled to prison. And then you'd sort of say, well, how many were getting recalled to prison anyway? How common is recall anyway? But for some reason, that's not sexy. That won't be the story. And that's what I want to know. I want to know why recall rates are so high generally, not specifically. I saw some amazing polling yesterday that even among Tory and Reform voters, nobody thinks that this crisis is of Labour's making. The polling was really interesting. So the best efforts of much of the print media certainly are failed really to make this look like Labour's fault. And yet the question of why recall rates are so high will still be largely ignored in favour of focusing on the use of the statistic as a stick with which to beat the current government. But forget the politics, okay? Seriously, forget the politics. That's just me getting something off my chest in full knowledge that I'm going to be proved completely right again. What happens? Because the only way you find out why recall rates are so high is by finding out what happens when you leave jail. The worst imaginable insight into what happens when you leave jail is photographers and film cameramen camped outside Wormwood Scrubs taking pictures of Bentleys and Lamborghinis, because the idea that the men getting into those vehicles are representative of the prison population or representative of the typical released prisoner is so ridiculous that I can't believe I have to spell it out. The normal experience will explain why, or the more normal experience will explain or help to explain why recall rates are so high. And in order to do that, you need to tell me what happens. So what happened to you? I've got no idea what it's like to be in jail. No idea at all. I can just about imagine it. But I've got even less idea what it's like to be released. Would I have my job to come back to? Would my wife still be waiting for me? Would I have anywhere to sleep? Where do I go? What do I do? How much money have I got in my bank account? If I didn't have savings when I went in, I'm not going to have savings when I come out. Is there a section of society about which we have been conditioned to care less than a released prisoner? Probably a serving prisoner. But I think I probably read more about the conditions in jails, albeit that I don't read enough, and we carried something on the programme yesterday from HMP Wandsworth. I think I probably know more about the conditions in jails than I do about the circumstances of getting out, of coming out. And I want to know why. I want to know what it's like. Because I am fairly confident that the reason why recall rates are so high is because a lot of people being released from prison never had a chance of staying out. But I don't want to arrive at that conclusion without more support or more evidence. You're more than welcome, as always, to ring me and tell me the opposite or tell me that I've got this completely wrong. But I don't think people are being recalled to prison because of a kind of innate recidivism or a genetic criminality. I think the licence conditions are sometimes ridiculous. I've heard stories of people being recalled to prison because they missed a bus to an appointment, and they really did miss the bus. It wasn't like a dog ate my homework explanation, but the regulations are so rigid that you barely have a chance. So there's lots going on here. I want to hear about the rules. I want to hear about the conditions that you have to stick by in order to avoid being recalled to prison. But I also want the bigger picture. I also want to know what it's like. I also want to know what the reality is of release. What do you get given? We've all seen the films, haven't we? I'm thinking of the Blues Brothers, am I? When you get given the bag that's got your paltry belongings in it. We've all seen that, but what on earth happens next? So what happens when a prisoner is released? 0345 6060 973. What happened to you or to your loved one? And secondly, why do you get called back? How silly can the reasons be? How hard is it to stay out if you are released in circumstances different from those enjoyed by the people being picked up in Lamborghinis and Bentleys? And the reason I'm doing this is because of how well the last hour went. So some days my confidence that there are enough people listening with the very precise and specific experiences to provide the rest of us with really big and helpful insights, my confidence soars after hours like the last hour, it can rarely be higher. So if you've never rung a radio station before in your life, if you've never listened to me before in your life, you can't quite believe this bloke on the radio is describing you, I need you to ring me. I need to hear from the inside of this experience why recall rates will be so high and what actually happens at the moment you walk through that door. I've got an idiot's corner for you. Perhaps on it, Dave writes, so now you want us to feel sorry for the crooks that burgled my house and pinched my car. I'm bothered about the victims, not the crooks. No, mate. I want to be confident that the people who burgled your house and nicked your car, if they go to jail, I want to be confident that when they come out, they won't be going back again, because either they will be helped to become better citizens of society, or they won't be victims of a stupid system. I don't know. I sometimes wonder how you can listen to the words that come out of my mouth and arrive at the conclusions that you arrive at. If the prisons are full and they're releasing people early, then expressing a desire to understand why so many are coming back to jail does not display sympathy for the crooks or callousness towards their victims. It is simply an attempt to understand things, Dave, which is why you're in Idiot's Corner and my switchboard will hopefully be populated by people who actually, A, know what I'm talking about, and B, can understand the relatively simple English that I've deployed up until this point. The numbers you need, 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 23 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Actually, I'm just going to take Dave out of Idiot's Corner for a minute, because that, I think, is why this system exists. It's why this situation exists, isn't it? It's because if you say it would be really good if people weren't being recalled to prison, it can be presented to the public as, oh, we're bending over backwards to help the offenders. We're giving them too much. We're being too sympathetic. And then you lose so what political capital is there to actually minimise the likelihood of prisoners being recalled to jail? None whatsoever. Except, of course, that that's the only way that you can solve the current prisons crisis. Kyle is in Ealing. Kyle, what would you like to say?
I would like to talk about you're talking about the recall, things with recalls.
Yes.
And why it's a big issue. I've been in prison before, and the amount of times I've been recalled, it's added up to me being numerous times in prison, and most of it was an accumulation of recalls.
What sort of things happen?
I remember, this is going back years back, and not even that far, but I remember times when I came out of prison, I had the ironclad will to change my life. And I felt that I came up against a system that was counterproductive to what my true intentions were.
Okay.
I noticed in the prison system as well, and the system as a whole, they seem to reward bad behaviour. So if you come out and they don't have an issue with you, there's not much support. But if they really, I don't know, into you, if they want to, if they think you're a threat, basically, they put things in place. But it's a double-edged sword. So you come out, you're in your pre-premises and stuff, and you're looking for a job, and you got there's things in place that make it harder to get a job. You've got to be in at a certain time. You've got to explain yourself to a probation officer. Not a problem. But then they seem to. Depends what you've been in prison for, but sometimes they overreact and they make it harder for you to just do the basic necessities like get a job. They'll call you 3-4 times while you're at work, sometimes ask you to come in earlier, and you're like, oh, I'll finish at 5 o'clock. No, I need you in at 4:30. No, I'll finish at 5. I was saying this to you yesterday.
And that would be, so what would you say is the most trivial thing you've been recalled for?
I remember I got a warning for having an offensive weapon in the interview, and it turned out it was a cone basically with metal picks, and that accumulated. And then when I kicked off about it, well, I didn't kick off, but I made a fuss about it.
Well, you didn't use the word kick off by accident. I mean, and it was something that you only ever used to comb your hair.
It was an Afro comb with metal picks, mate. I'm being real, and I got a warning for it. I got a license.
And then you used the phrase kick off, and I react in the way that I reacted, because of course, if someone accused me of having an offensive weapon in my pocket and it was my hairbrush or my comb, I would probably quote kick off end quotes. But in the context of a probation meeting, you can't do that without running the risk of being recalled.
Yeah, but when I say kick off, it's like there's fine margins. You might raise your voice for us for a moment, and they just turn that as aggressive behaviour. That comes down to poor behaviour, and then you'll be back in jail for something as little as maybe a misunderstanding in an interview. You don't really know what to do sometimes. If you tell the truth and be candid, they might take that as being passive aggressive. If you're being silent, they take that passive aggressive. There's many things why people get recalled. That's the main reason why the figures are full.
Well, if the figure is 50%, and this is the problem that I articulated a moment ago, it will be presented as proof that the early release scheme is a disaster, and we'll completely ignore the fact that, as you prove, this kind of thing has been going on for ages, and it goes on all the time. Carl, thank you. Jake is in Sheerness in Kent. Jake, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I run a company called that I won't name straight away.
You can if you want. Well, it depends what you do. Is it a candy floss company? That would be a little bit irrelevant.
I run a company where we take prisoners that are in a Category D prison, and or a couple of Category D prisons, and we place them into work. We train the guys up to become chefs, and we place them into work across Kent and the South East. And we do this because it's proven that if you tackle three main issues, which is sustainable housing, sustainable employment, and family ties, you're something like 86% less likely to reoffend.
I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? And yet
it's crazy. And when you're talking about recalls, we've had guys that work for us, and they've been recalled for. Such as one of our guys, his brother got attacked, and because his brother got attacked, the authorities were scared that he would retaliate, so he was recalled to prison. He didn't even know his brother had been attacked.
That was literally the reason. I suppose that he might perhaps have sought to avenge attacks on his brother in the past or something like that. There might be things that we don't know, but still, it seems like an incredibly low bar. And so if they've come to you, then they've demonstrated a desire to go straight, to stay out of jail. Yeah,
so we've got so many success stories. We've got guys that have gone on to run their own restaurants, executive chefs, head chefs. We look at things like guys' well-being, so we have like a well-being coach come in and have a chat with the guys. Most of our guys have never had a job before, so we will literally sit down and say, look, if you're going into make yourself a cup of tea, offer your colleagues a cup of tea, silly little things like that, the coaching that takes on. But these guys then continue in their jobs because not everyone gives these guys sorry, I'm a bit nervous. Not everyone gives these guys an opportunity. So our lads work really hard, and 40% of their salary goes to a victim of crime fund, which is a charity.
Oh wow! Well, gosh, well that addresses some of the concerns that we were looking at a moment ago. The incidence of it, I mean, as a problem that society has with these people. It's constant and big. It's not something that is going to blow up as a consequence of the latest round of early releases.
No, I mean, we've got a 100% non-reoffending rate, except for one guy that was recalled to prison because he was in a vehicle where the driver had a personal use marijuana on him.
Blimey.
And that guy who got arrested got no further action, but the guy who was in the passenger seat, who was one of our chefs, he got recalled to prison because there was behavioural issues where he's hanging around with the wrong people.
Who makes these decisions?
That's probation. That's probation. But he got released from police custody straight away, and then he didn't think anything of it, and then 2 days later he got recalled to prison, and he spent a year in prison further. His case was a bit extreme, so he's a lifer, so he's on a life licence.
Right. So the bar's very, very low for him.
Yes.
As people...
A lot of people don't realise that with a life licence, when people kick off and say, you should be locked up for life, they are in for a minimum sentence, and then they're on a life sentence, a life licence afterwards, after they're released from custody. So they still have to report to probation.
Yeah, would it be at the whim of a probation officer? Would you have some probation officers who do things that you consider to be stupid, and other probation officers who are on the same side as you are when it comes to rehabilitation and help, or is that?
I couldn't comment on that because I've never worked in probation. But I hear it from the guy's point of views, and so I'm coming from a biased point of view as well.
Only bias, experience bias, not opinion bias. Do you want to name the outfit that you work for, that you run?
Sure. Yeah, my company's called Linebird, and it's we're based in Kent and the South East.
Longbird, as in
Linebird, as in the fruit.
Linebird, okay.
It's Cockney rhyming slang for doing time.
Oh, is it? I've heard bird before. I hadn't heard linebird before. I didn't know.
Yeah, so when you hear someone doing bird, they are doing time.
I knew that, but I didn't know. But the lime's not part of the rhyming slang.
Yeah, bird lime.
Oh, bird lime time. Bird lime time. Oh, well, you live and learn. I was today years old when I finally found out why that was rhyming slang. It's 11:32. Thank you, Jake.
James O'Brien on LBC.
25 to 12. John's in Devisers. You and me both, James. I never knew that. I only knew the bird bit. Did you know that, Keith? Did you know it was bird lime time? Well, as soon as he said it, it made sense, but I'd never heard it before. I'm kind of like this. I got one text saying, I always thought it had something to do with the birdman of Alcatraz. That's from Tins. Yes, I had. Well, you live and learn. Rhyming slang is often, I find it fascinating, but it's often surprising because the original word gets lost in the mist of time. So you're sitting there trying to think, what does bird rhyme with? You're serving a prison sentence. What does bird rhyme with? And there it is. And that is the name, for those of you asking. The company was called Lime, as in the fruit, bird. So this was really interesting, the message that came in when I was in danger of being distracted by lessons in Cockney rhyming slang. I want to find it. It was from someone whose son-in-law is an ex-offender. Here it is. It's from Jan, who's in Camden. My son-in-law's an ex-offender. When he heard of the early release plans, his first words were that unless they're only releasing those with a home to go to, and that they've got some sort of plan in place for the future, they'll be back in weeks. In fact, in some cases, days, I think. I saw one fella who was being released yesterday saying he'd already seen some of his mates who'd been released in the first round of early releases come back in again. And that is a disaster on every level. It's a disaster in every imaginable way. Jan goes on, because life is better for them on the inside than it is on the outside. He was lucky enough to have a vision. He worked to obtain a degree. He now has a managerial job in prison reform. He's even devised a full education and employment programme, which he's hoping to get the prison service to adopt. They've even made documentaries about him, but obviously it ain't easy. So what actually happens? And you know I'm right. You know that the conversations, if I was a lazier style of phone-in host, we'd have a conversation about, what a disaster this scheme has been because they're all coming back to jail. But the conversation needs to be about what is in place to help make sure they don't come back to jail. And the answer is nothing in some cases. So what happens when you come out? Everyone's thinking of Ronnie Barker, if you're of the right age. What happens when the gate opens and you haven't got? So the more I think about it, the more unhelpful it is to have all the coverage today of the fancy cars that are picking up a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of these people. What about the fella that just walks out with the money in his pocket? What happens to him? And how likely is he to be back within days or weeks? 0345 6060 973. I want people, obviously, who work in the sector as well, people who work in probation as well, to tell me what chance do they have? Dan's in Rayleigh. Dan, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon, James.
Hello,
I also didn't know, considering I've done bird, I didn't know where the slang come from either. So that,
well, that makes me feel a bit better about my ignorance. You live and learn. I tell you what, if he's yanking our chain, it's got halfway around the world now before the.
Yeah,
but I think it's
true. He might be there.
I think it's true. What made you pick up the phone, Dan?
So I mean, like I said, I've been through the prison system. I would what I'd like to call myself a success story coming out. I was quite fortunate. That when I come out, I had a job to go to. I think it's probably worth mentioning that your sentence starts the day that you get sentenced. And the onus is put on you that you're working from the day you start. You're working towards your release. You've got a release date. You're told about why you're in prison in the different. I mean, I've done 3 different categories of prison: B, C, and D. So B is sort of high security. C is getting near the end of your sentence, and D is an open prison.
Yeah.
So excuse me.
That's right.
I done a couple of years in a B cat prison. Went to a C cat for a year. Then I was lucky enough to go to a D cat prison, which are resettlement prisons. They don't have walls or anything like that. The officers who work there it's a lot more relaxed. Very few of them carry any sort of batons or mace or anything like that. They don't carry handcuffs. Some people think it was a holiday camp. It certainly isn't. If
Sure.
it is, it's the worst holiday camp you go to.
But it's getting you ready. It's getting you ready for emergence into the outside world.
Yeah. And it's not a quick process either. You can go to. I was at one for 2 years. The first year you do sort of voluntary work. You're allowed out on day release some days, and then you work towards you go home for a weekend if you've got family to go to and an address to go to. And then in your last year you can find full-time employment. Like your last caller mentioned that he takes lads on, or men and women on that are
from Cat Ds, yes.
Yeah, basically, yeah. I was fortunate to do the same. I got a job working in engineering.
And how rare is your experience? So when you see 1,100, I mean, if the figure is close to 50%, as seems pretty likely, how shocked are you by that, knowing what you know?
I'm not shocked, but I would say that the responsibility should be more on the prisoner. Now, coming from experience, pretty much 95% of the people you speak to still think they're victims in there. They think they're hard done by.
Sure.
They don't recognise that what they've done was wrong. Now, I told myself on the day that I got convicted that this was my fault, this was my own doing, I deserve to be here. I'm the only one to blame, no one else. And that's when the remorse starts. And then I think once you get that clear and you level that with yourself, then you can work towards the day you're getting out. And that however long it is. Some people are only in there for a short amount of time. I was in there for a sort of medium-term sentence. And from the day there, my focus was on getting myself back into society to never come back. People do enjoy it in there, unfortunately. You do get people that come institutionalised, and it's hard to break that cycle. I don't know how they would get around it. I was also very fortunate that I had a very good probation officer. I made contact with them when I was in the open prison, and I went to go and see him a couple of times, and we discussed what I was going to do when I was released.
How long ago was this?
I got released in 2016.
Because I mean, Chris Grayling's got his hand on the probation service since then, hasn't he?
Yeah. I mean, I know people that are still have been to prison since, and I from what I understand, it's not got any better.
If you hadn't got anything in place, did you have a home to go to?
Yeah.
Okay. What? I may not get anyone who's actually done it from this side of the story, so I'll ask you because you're closer to it than I am. If you haven't got family, you haven't got a place to go, and you haven't got any savings, what happens when you walk out the door? You haven't got a job. So I appreciate your point, and I accept, not least because you've been through it, that we could say prisoners could do more to have something in place when they come out. But if you haven't got a home,
it would be much harder. Much harder. Yeah. And I think if someone was to sit me down and say, how would you reform the prison service? I would say you need to build and have more open prisons, because that's the best way to resettle someone.
Okay.
You're slowly letting them back out into the society. You're still a prisoner, and you still have to abide by very strict conditions.
And this, of course, to steer us back to the theme of this programme, of course, the tabloids would be all over the easy holiday camp, walk in the park narrative, and that is actually going to minimise reoffending and reduce the likelihood of a recall.
Yeah, that's just ignorance. Like I said earlier, if they think that's a holiday camp, some of the prisons, the open prisons there, I mean, it'd be the worst holiday camp. You'd want your money back.
You would indeed. Yeah. I take your point. It's not something I ever subscribe to, but that idea of if you want people to stay on the straight and narrow, then they probably need A, to help themselves, as Dan's point, it can't be ignored at all, and B, they need a little bit more help from the system, whether it is, I mean, some of these rules that you hear about, if you break these conditions, you are recalled to prison. So you can be recalled to prison. This is a point I don't think many members of the public understand. I certainly didn't understand it until relatively recently. You can be recalled to prison for behaviour or action that wouldn't come close to getting you sent to prison in the first place. And for the avoidance of doubt, that is how it should be, because you are on licence. Your sentence is longer than the time you have served. And therefore, when you come out, you have to abide by behaviour that is much more closely scrutinised and policed than if you were not on licence. It's literally what on licence means. But I think that we have in our heads the idea that and certainly the tabloids won't help with this, if the figure of recalls is as high as 50%, it's going to be huge headlines. And an awful lot of people will come away from that coverage thinking that these people who have been released early for having served a sentence, part of a sentence, for example, for GBH, they will genuinely think, in fact, I bet you might have been susceptible to this misapprehension as well, because I think I was. That if you say, oh, that bloke was released, he did GBH, he got released early, and now he's been recalled, somewhere in my head I'm thinking, oh, he's done another GBH. So somewhere in my head I'm thinking, oh, he's turned over another bank. I'm not thinking he had a comb in his pocket and got cross when he was accused of having a weapon. I'm not thinking the bus got cancelled or the train was delayed so he didn't get to his probation meeting. I'm not thinking his brother got attacked and the authorities thought that he was likely to seek vengeance, so he went back to jail. Crikey, this doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's quite extraordinary, right? When it happens live on the radio. How many people listening to this right now thought, when they looked at stories about recall to prison, when they heard headlines about recall to prison, when they heard coverage of prisoners being released early and then coming back to jail, how many people thought they must have done something that would have got them jailed in the first place? You did, didn't you? Tell me the truth. You did, didn't you? Thought they must have done something that would have got them jailed from a standing start. They've been recalled to jail. They must have robbed another bank. They must have committed another grievous bodily harm. They must have gone back to dealing drugs. They must have done... And that is one of the most coruscating proofs I can ever provide of the damage that journalism does to society. Because I am a journalist. And I could easily have come away from coverage of these stories thinking that. In fact, probably subconsciously, even when I sat down today, I'm thinking, I know about the stories about missed buses. I know about the but somewhere inside I'm thinking, oh, they must have all gone out and committed crimes again. That's crazy, right? 11:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
I don't know if it's brainwashing, as Andrew suggests, but I think we've all been a little bit susceptible to it, judging from my inbox. Apparently, if you watch a series called Parole on the BBC, then you will not be in the category that I was describing a moment ago, the category of people in which hundreds of you are, by your own admission, that when someone gets recalled to prison, you presume that they've done something criminal. They've done something that would probably have got them sent to prison in the first place, but it couldn't really be further from the truth, which makes an absolute mockery of most of the conversations that we have in this space, doesn't it? Or most of the conversations that we hear in this space. It's 10 to 12, it's Wednesday. That doesn't come as a major shock to anybody, the second bit, but it does mean that PMQs will be upon us. It's the deputies today. So the Labour deputy leader, Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, right? Who can remember who the other one is? Who is Angela Rayner going to be going up against at the dispatch box in 10 minutes or so? Anyone? Bueller? Is that... Yeah. Well, you'll find out shortly. Kelly's in Canning Town. I bet you can't remember, can you, Kelly?
No.
Don't worry. Not can my colleague. You're very welcome. What made you pick up the phone?
So I actually work in the homeless service at the moment in the sector. And I just wanted to call in because time and time again in the service that I ran, which is based in East London, we were seeing people come out of prison with no plan around housing, around support needs, if they've got substance use, mental health. And it really is just a cycle. So someone will come out, they don't know where they're staying, they might not have a phone, they might not know where they need to go to access the probation services. And so it's just a vicious cycle. And so my team, we kind of were navigators. So we were tasked to kind of go out and find people and try and bring them back into the support services that they need. But if you can't find them to then deliver that service, you're already stuck. So what I attempted to do, but failed, unfortunately, was to try and link in with the prison services whilst they were serving time to try and have that communication and that dialogue with the services that were already in there. So then there's a support mechanism around them ready for when they come out. So they've already met who their worker is going to be. They've already discussed, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is what it's going to look like when you come out. This is what we need to complete the day of your release. All of those things would then support people who don't have a home.
People listening would just presume that happened. And not only does it not happen, but your attempts to make it happen were rebuffed.
Absolutely. So then, of course, that person needs to survive. So in order for them to survive, they will commit petty crime. You know, they might want to go and shoplift to then be able to have a meal.
Right.
If they have substance use challenges, they need to feed that habit. So they need to go and commit crime to potentially feed that habit. And so the support that they may have got inside, whilst it might have been useful, once they come out, if it's not there, they're only going to fall short.
Has it got worse in recent years? How long have you been doing it?
I would say so. So I've been doing it since COVID, since 2021.
Gosh, so not that long.
So not that long, but I've seen a lot. And certainly in East London, the services have reduced. And because the different agencies don't necessarily talk to each other in the way that they should, the information falls short. So you're constantly always trying to catch up. So that's how it is for a professional. So you can only imagine how it is if you're coming out trying to navigate. You've got papers that you might have been given. You don't know what to do with them. I had one client who was housed in an area where it was so far away from all his support services. Yeah. How were they expecting him to get back? So, you know, my argument was always, okay, you've placed him in South London, but all his support services are in East. If he hasn't got a job, how is he meant to buy a mobile phone to make contact with you? Gosh. How is he meant to get his Oyster card?
So he's back inside. He's back inside in no time.
And then he's back in. Yeah. And for some, it's easier because obviously that's stability for them. They're getting a hot meal. They're getting facilities to shower, clothes. You know, I've had people come out where they don't even have shoes. So...
and you're looking at the numbers of recall rates, and you're thinking even if it was 80%, there's part of me thinking it's a miracle it's not higher. I mean, you know, and then a lot of the coverage today is showing people being picked up in Bentleys. Couldn't be less helpful. Mm-hmm. What if we had to unravel the rationale behind this? Has it just become a box ticking exercise? I mean, by all means, cast aspersions on some of the people that you've come across on their motivations and their competence, but my amateurish take on it would be that the system is so overrun that literally they don't have time to care where they put someone. They've just got to put them somewhere.
Absolutely. And it's heartbreaking in some ways because some people do come out and there is that willingness there to not want to have that life anymore. But if you don't have the option and you don't have the skill set and the ability to support yourself, and you're relying on services to provide that to you or help you build that so it's sustainable.
It's just bizarre.
You're nowhere.
And then politicians are obsessing about, I don't know what they're obsessing about, but for 14 years they've done absolutely nothing about a system that does the polar opposite of what you would expect it to do or what it was originally designed to do. I wonder if it is the holiday camp syndrome, Kelly. I wonder, and that message we got from Dave earlier, I wonder if right-wing media has so successfully turned any attempt to rehabilitate criminals, to help criminals, to look after them, has turned it into a sort of toxic notion of them having an easy ride or prisons being holiday camps or we're bending over backwards to help the offenders and we're ignoring the victims. Really, really lazy, emotional button pushing has actually, the tail in a way has started wagging the dog, and it's actually made the system worse than it would have been otherwise. I'm just sort of thinking out loud about what other reasons there might be for this being permitted to happen by politicians.
I mean, if you're thinking about it from because I'm literally working now.
I'm
talking to you. If you're thinking about it from the perspective of the offender as well.
Yes.
If you've done that so many times, you will become institutionalized, and you will, in your mind, think that this is just me. This is just my way of life. And it's about breaking that down to give them the hope that, you know what, this doesn't have to be you. This is a moment in time, but with support, the adequate support, you can come out the other side. They can't do it on their own. And it's so hard working in services which there isn't that level, I think, of money in it to be able to sustain the amount of workers you need. And
there won't be. So we're back again. So many topics keep coming back to this same place, that you need to spend a lot of money today in order to save a ton of money tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. Sending people back to jail is expensive for society. Kelly, thank you. I mean, talk about proving my point about the calibre of the callers today. Literally on a shift at the moment, working with people or supporting homeless people, up to and including people recently released from prison, which is something Julie knows about. She texted me to say, my nephew was released early last year, James, with one... Last year? You mean they were releasing people early when Labour weren't in power? Whatever next. Might read it in a newspaper. My nephew was released early last year with 1 day's notice and no plan in place. He spent that night in a car park, James. Fortunately, a friend took him in, or he would have been back behind bars in a moment. There it is. So when you see this figure, as you certainly will, when you encounter this coverage, as you certainly will, remember two things. Number one, it's not new. And number two, the people being recalled to prison have likely not even committed a crime. They just have not been helped, if you like, onto the straight and narrow in the ways that most responsible citizens would quite like to see. I glance at my screen. I see the UK and Germany are signing a defence agreement, which is extraordinary. It might come up in PMQs, but of course the fact that the UK and Germany are signing a defence agreement means that the PM won't be there. It's the day of the deputies today, because Aggie Chambray is with me to tee up PMQs, which will be between, just to kill the suspense, Angela Rayner, Aggie and...
Oliver Dowden.
Oliver Dowden. Gosh, he's still a thing.
Just about.
Well, I never... Ew, crikey, I don't know if I should thank you for bringing him back into my consciousness or indeed my memory. What do we think is going to happen?
Well, we are exactly 1 week away from the budget, and I think that will probably dominate. Having said that, basically ever since Labour got into power and Rishi Sunak's been on the opposition benches, I've been pretty consistently surprised by what has been brought up.
Yes.
So actually, we may get a surprise again, but I would expect that they will use this session, Oliver Dowden will use this session to set traps and try and pin down Labour and get them to flesh out what manifesto commitments actually meant, probably in terms of that working person definition ahead of the budget next week. I think Rishi Sunak did that pretty successfully a couple of weeks ago when he went and tried to get Keir Starmer to rule out national insurance employee contributions. And Keir Starmer didn't. And ever since then, people have been saying, OK, well, probably in the budget next week, we will see an increase to national insurance employee contributions. So I wonder whether after the success of that will come up again. Since it's Angela Rayner doing it, I wonder whether we will also hear something about the Employment Rights Bill. The second reading happened earlier this week. And at the same time as second reading, there was an impact assessment document published which showed that it's likely to cost business £4.5 billion a year. Now, Labour are very much arguing, the government's arguing that it's still going to help growth. But obviously that's a pretty tricky headline, especially when the impact assessment also said it's going to affect small businesses disproportionately and that businesses are likely to pass on the cost to consumer. And of course, I would be not unsurprised were the row with Donald Trump and the Labour Party were to come up. So this is...
It's a confected row for people who are unaware of this story. It's a complete nothing burger. You have a repeated, multiple convicted felon somehow pretending that the Labour Party is doing something wrong when individuals decide to spend some of their annual leave campaigning for Kamala Harris. But it makes headlines and it potentially embarrasses Labour.
I think it potentially does embarrass Labour. I mean, basically, to your point, it hinges on this sentence on a now deleted LinkedIn post, "We will sort out your housing." And the suggestion is, wrongly, I think, according to the Labour Party, that it implies that there would be payment for that housing. That is not the case.
Put up by other volunteers, by Democrat volunteers.
Exactly, which is not against the rules in any case. But obviously it's all sensitive because Keir Starmer and the government want to have a good relationship with Donald Trump because they think he might win the election on November the 5th.
Yes, of course. And that does make it look ill-advised. But it is individuals, and it's not politicians even, is it? I mean, it is individual people who support the Labour Party or work within the Labour Party choosing to spend their holidays. But they must be mad, in my opinion, but doing even more political campaigning on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, and it's something that's gone on for years and years.
It'd be interesting to see whether Dowden brings this up or not.
Well, the response would be the fact that the Conservatives do this too. I mean, there's such a well-oiled history of both parties sending kind of party members over to volunteer in American elections. I don't know whether he'll bring it up. I wonder whether it will come up from a backbench MP. But I think probably taxes, the budget, and possibly the Commonwealth Head of Government meeting that Sir Keir Starmer is at the moment. I think those will be the things that Oliver Dowden goes on.
There is a lot going on, actually, isn't there? And this is the moment where I remind you that we will cross live to the House of Commons at the moment that Oliver Dowden gets to his feet and begins his questions for the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, in the chair today. I can't... Oh, well, there it is, as if by magic.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Deputy Prime Minister in paying tribute to the bravery of Sir Chris Hoy? He truly is an inspiration to us all. And I also echo her comments about the train crash in Powers. Mr. Speaker, what is the Deputy Prime Minister's definition of working people?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, let me start by welcoming the honourable gentleman to his new place. Today is our first exchange, Mr. Speaker, since he pushed for a July general election. And if his own side hasn't offered him a peerage, I certainly would have. And Mr. Speaker, the definition of working people are the people that the Tory party have failed for the last 14 years.
Oliver Dowden.
Well, the Deputy Prime Minister stood on a manifesto promising not to raise taxes on working people. It now appears she can't even define who working people are. So I'll give her another go. There are 5 million small business owners in this country. Are they working people?
Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how the shadow Deputy Prime Minister can stand there with a straight face when it was the small businesses, the working people of this country that paid the price of them crashing the economy, sending interest rates scoring. I think he needs to learn his own lessons in opposition.
Oliver Dowden.
Well, I think the whole House will have heard the Deputy Prime Minister disregard 5 million hard-working small business owners. These are the publicans, the shopkeepers, the family running a local cafe. None of those count as working people to her. Now, Labour gave a clear commitment not to raise national insurance. The independent IFS have given their view on this. They say that raising employer national insurance is a tax on working people. Even the Chancellor said that raising employer national insurance was a jobs tax that will make each new recruit more expensive and increase the cost to business. So does she agree with the IFS and her own Chancellor?
Mr. Speaker, I remember the party opposite, what they said to business. What was it, F to business? Whereas this party held an international investment summit last week, which poured £63 million into our economy. We're pro-business, pro-worker, and getting on with fixing the mess that they left behind.
So I think we can take it from that answer that the Deputy Prime Minister doesn't agree with the IFS, and I suppose it shouldn't come as a surprise that she doesn't agree with her Chancellor. But does she agree with this? And I quote, "Working people will pay when employers pass on the hike in national insurance." Mr. Speaker, these are her words. So does she at least agree with herself?
Mr. Speaker, what I'm incredibly proud of is this week, this government brought in a new employment bill, which will raise the living standards of 10 million workers. Would the shadow Deputy Prime Minister like to apologise for the hike in taxes, 70-year hike in taxes that he put on working people, the crashing of the economy and the disaster that he left behind?
Well, she mentions her policy. Let's be clear, it's a £5 billion hit to the British economy, and that's her own assessment. Mr. Speaker, I think that following these answers, there will be millions of working people now even more worried about the tax rises coming their way in next week's budget. But As this is our last exchange across the dispatch box, I'd like to turn to somebody I hope we can all agree is a hard-working person, His Majesty the King. Yeah. Will she join me in sending him best wishes ahead of the Commonwealth Summit in Samoa? In particular, will she confirm that this government recognises the unique role played by the Commonwealth? And will she commit to deepening this relationship so that under His Majesty's leadership, we build upon possibly the greatest legacy of the late Queen?
Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister.
I will miss our exchanges. Gingers, the late nights voting, and in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, I will agree with my right honourable friend. The King does a tremendous job, and so did the late Queen, and the Commonwealth is very important, and that's why the King and the Prime Minister at the moment are working together. Thank you.
Yeah. Oliver Dowden.
Well, I thank the right honourable lady for that answer. Our Commonwealth family is brought together by historical and cultural ties, indeed, much like the pair of us. But I will resist, Mr. Speaker, the temptation to replicate that. But as we look to the Commonwealth's future, we now have the opportunity to deepen our economic relationship. Will she therefore assure the House that the Prime Minister will use this summit to continue the work begun by the last government in building deeper economic ties with our Commonwealth friends and allies?
Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we talk about economics. The architect of the 2024 Tory general election campaign, doing his victory lap before retiring with the hereditary peers that he fought so hard to protect. He leaves behind a Tory party in utter denial, heads in the sand, refusing to accept the rejection by the British public. Their plan for Britain, Mr. Speaker, includes scrapping the minimum wage, cutting maternity pay and tax breaks for the big oil companies. Mr. Speaker, this Labour government is elected to end the Tory chaos.
Dr. Evans, you've got a sore neck. I wish it was your throat to lick. Come on, Deputy.
Mr. Speaker, they don't like to hear it, but this Labour government was elected to end the Tory chaos, and that's exactly what we're doing. £600 more in the pockets of insecure workers, 30,000 new dads given paternity leave, and 10 million working people better off. While their so-called leadership candidates argue about what went wrong, this Labour government is getting on with rebuilding Britain.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, like many MPs, have heard many heart-rending stories of constituents who have had poor end-of-life support. Yet had palliative care been available alongside an end-of-life plan, their experiences could have been so different. Would the Deputy Prime Minister agree to set up a commission for palliative and end-of-life care so that everyone can access the very best support when terminally ill and have a peaceful and dignified death? And will she meet to discuss it?
Yeah. I thank my right honourable friend for raising what is an emotive subject on both sides of this House. I know from my own work in this area before I was in this place what an incredible work this is and the honour it is to be there for somebody at the end of their life. Discussions have begun now on how to improve access to palliative and end-of-life care, and I'll ensure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss this issue.
Yeah. Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I associate myself and the Liberal Democrats with the Deputy Prime Minister's remarks about Chris Hoy and all those involved in the train crash. Our NHS is bracing itself for a winter crisis. And one of the causes of the winter crisis every year is that there are thousands of people in hospitals who are fit to go home, but they can't be discharged because there are not the care workers in place to enable people to recover at home or in a care home. Will the Deputy Prime Minister consider the Liberal Democrats' idea of an NHS winter task force to winter-proof our NHS, end this cycle of the winter crisis and put to an end the scandal of hospital patients paying the price of the social care crisis left by the Conservatives?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments, and I share with her desire to ensure that care workers are given the respect and the importance that they deserve. They are critical, in my opinion, to solving the problems within our National Health Service, and it's the Labour Party that will create a national care service, and we're launching our first ever fair pay agreement for care professionals to boost recruitment and retention. We must get the NHS back on its feet after the disaster of the Conservatives, and my right honourable friend the Chancellor will have more to say in the budget.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her answer. We stand ready as a party of constructive opposition to work with the government to fix our social care system. However, one of the measures that could make it harder for us to keep the carers that we so desperately need would be an increase in employers' national insurance contributions. Were that measure to go ahead, it would affect millions of small businesses, including 18,000 small care providers. Can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister to assure this House that there will be nothing in the budget that makes it harder for vulnerable people to access the care workers and the care that they desperately need?
Deputy Prime Minister. Well, again, I won't speculate on the budget, not least with the Chancellor sat at the side of me. But what I will say, and I'll reiterate what the Chancellor has said and what the Prime Minister has said, this will be a budget that recognises that working people of this country and the enterprise in this country has been hard hit by the 14 years of Conservatives. We will rebuild Britain and we will grow our economy to pay for our public services.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It is 13 minutes after 12. Liam, I think, speaks for many of us. It feels like the last day of term, James, when the teacher puts a Disney film on. It did have a very sort of D-mob happy air to it, not least perhaps because, as Angela Rayner referred to on a couple of occasions, it is the last time that she will face Oliver Dowden across the dispatch box, unless Aggie Chambray, I suppose, unless whoever leads the Tory party next decides to keep Oliver Dowden in post as their deputy, which is unlikely.
Unlikely, but anything could happen.
And you can say that again. We shall pick over the bones of what we've just heard after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:16, and you have just heard. I mean, it's not exactly one for the history books, is it? Oliver Dowden's last PMQs, but it was a very well-tempered exchange.
It was indeed. I mean, Oliver Dowden obviously tried to get Angela Rayner to explain what a working person is after we spent the entire election campaign with Labour saying they were not going to raise taxes on working people. And Oliver Dowden was obviously trying to get her to admit, perhaps, that in the budget, which we are expecting a week today, they will raise taxes on working people because if they were to raise taxes on, I don't know, the National Insurance Employee Contribution, which it sounds like they might, and Oliver Dowden suggesting that actually they were going to raise taxes on working people unless Angela Rayner would say what a working person was, which she did not. I felt like she didn't particularly answer those questions, instead prevaricating and talking about what the Conservatives had done during their 14-year history instead of actually specifically answering what a working person was.
Is there something about £100,000 as well? I know he didn't bring it up specifically, but hasn't there been a lot of chatter about whether or not people earning over £100,000 are actually working people, and Labour are struggling to pin them down on this, which is an interesting ploy, I think, electorally, because I'm not sure that there is an enormous amount of sympathy for people earning over £100,000 in fiscal terms, except perhaps on Conservative benches and among Conservative supporting media.
I think you might be right. I mean, the interesting thing was, Sir Keir Starmer did actually define what he thought a working person was during the election campaign. He said, the person I have in my mind when I say working person is people who earn their living, rely on our services, and don't really have the ability to write a cheque when they get into trouble.
Yeah.
But that is so broad. And I guess the point that Oliver Dowden was
trying... But it would exclude most people earning over £100,000 a year.
Yeah, that's true. But I guess the point that Oliver Dowden was trying to make during that point is, well, if you're going to raise employee contributions for national insurance, are you saying that small business owners aren't working people? So it is going to be difficult, and I think it will continue to be difficult into next week, into the budget conversations. And that's what Oliver Dowden tried, and I would say actually tried successfully to do, despite the fact that he did it all with a smile on her face. And it did sort of seem like they were getting on well, even with those jokes at the end about both being ginger and making nice comments about the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. But you know, that was the last one ever. I think it was the fourth one they've ever done together. And unless, as you say, the Tory leader, the next Tory leader, either Kemi Badenoch or Robert Jenrick, decides to promote Oliver Dowden or keep him in post, a deputy leader, that was the last one.
I'd like to read out a few messages at this point in proceedings, just to show you the variety of opinion. Angela Rayner is absolutely brilliant. Definitely should be PM, says Tony. Dowden is running rings around Rayner. She sounds like a stuck record, says Rob, and I'm a fan. And Phil asks, is Oliver Dowden drunk? D-Mob happy. I'll say it, shall I? D-Mob happy, Phil, as opposed to drunk. And then Daisy Cooper.
And then Daisy Cooper. So Daisy Cooper, the deputy Lib Dem leader, of course. Now she, as I think you would expect, because the Lib Dems tend to talk a lot about NHS and care, she asked whether the government would consider her party's idea for a winter task force for the NHS to ensure that more care leavers are available for people leaving hospital. Angela Rayner didn't really answer that. She said that they do want to improve care and get the NHS back on its feet, and also then went on to say she wouldn't speculate on the budget, but the budget will rebuild Britain. So I would say we didn't get that many specific answers from Angela Rayner, either to Daisy Cooper or to Oliver Dowden, or indeed particularly to Rachel Maskell, who's a backbench Labour MP. I think she's a York MP, who asked about palliative care at the end of life, and Angela Rayner saying, we can meet the minister, we'll look at this, but not really giving her a specific answer on that either.
I should add, Wes Streeting is joining Sheila at 1 o'clock to take your calls, and he has revealed that he will vote against the assisted dying bill over concerns that end-of-life care is not good enough for patients to make an informed choice. That's an extraordinary intervention from the Secretary of State for Health.
And I think it really paints how big an issue this might be. I mean, the fact that he is going to be the minister in charge of implementing this were it to pass, and he's voting against it, is really difficult. And it's already a difficult debate. But Sir Simon Case, who is the Cabinet Secretary, has written to all of the Cabinet and asked them, because this is a free vote, basically asked them to remain neutral, asked them to not say their opinion, say whether they're going to vote for or against it. So Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, told MPs that on Monday night. It's been leaked. Shabana Mahmood, who's the Justice Secretary, has done an interview to say she'll be voting against as well. But it's difficult
because of her unshakable belief in the sanctity and the value of human life. Indeed.
But it's difficult for Cabinet Ministers because, now I wonder whether a few who are on the side of really thinking this is important to go through will feel they need to speak out and talk about it, even though they've all been told not to, because it's difficult. If some Cabinet Ministers are, others aren't. Sir Keir Starmer, we know, has previously talked about being pro the law going through. He obviously hasn't said that since the free vote has been announced. But it's going to be really difficult, and I can already pick up, it's being talked about a lot in the comments.
Is it?
And like round corners, it's the thing that everyone is talking about. Everyone wants to know how everyone's going to vote. And I think there's already a bit of anger. There's already worry about it being based on emotion and the fact that they're only going to get the legislative framework 2 weeks before they actually have to vote on it. I think there's concern, there's emotion. I think this has a long way to go, and I think it was going to be a difficult debate.
Speaking of what goes on in the House of Commons, so some people watching, and I don't know if you noticed because you were busy listening, but at one point, a couple of people have questioned whether they were hearing things or whether there was even a flirtatious air to some of the exchanges that we just heard between Rayner and Dowden. And at one point, I think Angela Rayner did that. For people watching on YouTube, I'm now making a heart shape with my hands in the style of young people. Angela Rayner actually did that across the House of Commons. I think that's the point at which Oliver Dowden said to Mr. Speaker, I won't be returning that. So for people who think they all hate each other, genuinely hate each other, the tone of those exchanges would have come as something of a surprise.
But I think that's great. I think it's brilliant when they sort of prove that they do have more in common than that which divides them, to quote Joe Cox. Of course they get on. Of course loads of them get on. They sit on select committees together. They have coffees together. You see it. Some of them do get on really well. Some of them do genuinely, viscerally hate each other. I always thought Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson seemed to viscerally hate each other. But I think those pair genuinely don't. And it'll be interesting to see who Angela Rayner's up with next time she's on with the Deputy Leader of the Conservatives.
Well, should we speculate?
Ooh, go on.
Well, I don't know. I'm thinking let's pretend for the time being that Robert Jenrick wins. Who are his sort of key allies?
So Robert Jenrick... Well, OK, I'm going to say first, I think if Kemi wins, you might have someone like Laura Trott, who was Chief Secretary to the Treasury. I wonder whether someone like her could become Deputy Leader. She's really highly rated, really liked.
Even after that interview with Evan Davis?
Even after that interview with Evan Davis, I remember the one. I think she...
Well, I suppose it depends on the depth of the talent puddle, doesn't it, in this? OK, so it'd be two women for the first time, I think.
that'd be cool, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think, who would it be for Robert Jenrick?
Does he have any friends?
Yes.
Are you sure?
I'm very confident. I can't think of any of them right now, but he genuinely does definitely have friends.
Do they go to a different school? Could that be what it is?
Who would it be? I mean,
and anyway, but we'll speculate on that. People can make their own suggestions. Who ran his campaign?
Or
who is running his campaign? It's not Grant Shapps. Grant Shapps said he was,
no, he
but
says
he was actually running James Cleverly's.
Not.
Yes.
I wonder whether Suella... I mean, that would be a bit bonkers, wouldn't it? But Suella Braverman has come out and said that she is pro-Robert Jenrick.
I think she could be deputy?
I mean, it would be quite the statement, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would indeed. What was I going to say? Remind us what the sort of state of play is on that. When do we get our decisions? When does it go to the membership? So the MPs have finished their role now.
The MPs have finished their role now. Conservative members are voting, and I think they've got until the end of the week to finish voting. And then we get the result on November the 2nd. So it is really in its final stages. It does sound like, when I speak to people involved, that the more likely winner is going to be Kemi Badenoch. But it's really difficult because Conservative members polling is really, really, really difficult to do. The Conservative members are sort of a bit of an unknowable beast. But people do, at the moment, think Kemi Badenoch. But previously, people thought Robert Jenrick. And before that, people thought James Cleverly.
So it's gone all the way around the houses.
Indeed,
but
it has.
Certainly, I think the newspapers that brought you Liz Truss and Boris Johnson seem to favour Kemi Badenoch, don't they, generally?
Well, I think so. I mean, yesterday we had Charles Moore, we had Danny Finkelstein both coming out for Kemi Badenoch, and it does seem like she's increasingly becoming, I suppose, more of the establishment figure, which is interesting. I think Robert Jenrick has potentially boxed himself in a bit too much on leaving the European Convention
of Human Rights, which is an extraordinary thing to have done and appeals exclusively to people who've sort of fallen for Nigel Farage's shtick. So it alienates an awful lot of Tories who, for example, would share Winston Churchill's view on the European Convention of Human Rights.
Well, you heard it. I mean, Chris Patten was on, former chairman of the Conservative Party, was on at the weekend, and he was suggesting they both look a bit weird, and said he could just never, even though he thinks Kemi Badenoch looks weird too, he could never vote for someone who was up for leaving that.
No. Well, we shall follow with interest. So there'll be one more PMQ next week. It will be Starmer and Sunak. And then straight after that, it'll be the budget. Yes.
And then just a couple of days later, so that's the 30th, and then we've got on Saturday, what day for it? We've got the Conservative Party announcement for who will be the leader.
A week on Saturday?
So, a week on Saturday. So then, the budget, and then 3 days later.
So one more PMQs, and then a new leader for the Tories.
New leader on the Saturday.
The next but one.
Yeah. And
the PMQs.
And then they'll sort of make headlines for about a day until 3 days later. It's the US election.
The excitement is off the charts, isn't it? Thank you, Aggie. Have we got any little bits of Donald Trump? Donald Trump has been up to his usual antics in recent times in America, and I promised you that I'd try and bring you a clip or two every single day. We'll see if we've got that. I'll take a quick call, I think, from Ryan, if he's still awake, on the and that's a reflection on PMQs, not a reflection on Aggie Chambray, on this early release scheme and what actually happens when you leave prison. And we've put you through, Ryan, because you couldn't really be better qualified to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah, hello there, James. Afternoon. Yeah, no, I was released today on the early release scheme, and I see that you've been talking about people that have been recalled and stuff like that, and the amount of people that have been recalled for things that crimes they haven't even done, and they've still got to sit in there for a year before they can even go in front of parole. Even if they get what's called NFA, they still have to go in front of a parole board and not released from the prison after being found not guilty of something.
What? I don't understand that. So you mean because you don't have to commit a crime to get recalled, you just have to breach the regulations. You just have to break the rules.
Yeah, so if you breach regulations, or say for argument's sake, if you was out with a group of people and your crime is, say, you were selling drugs before you went to prison, or that's what you went away for, and you was out with a group of people, and for some reason, whatever, the police came and somebody got searched, and not you yourself had the drugs on you, but the person you was with does, you would be recalled for that.
Yeah,
and even if you have nothing to do with them, they might be just out on you might be on a night out with a group of people, and you're just happen to be with them, and they're the ones, and you're going to be the one that gets arrested.
So no crime has been committed by the person who is going back to jail. What time were you released today?
I was released at 8 o'clock this morning.
And when were you told that you were going to be released at 8 o'clock this morning?
I knew. Well, I was meant to have been released yesterday, but because I'm going on HDT tag, we were released today.
And what happens now? So you came out. Were you in jail in Leeds?
I was in.
You don't have to tell me.
Then,
I'm not prying.
I'm just trying to work out my timeline.
Oh, okay.
I was in Scrubs.
Right.
That's where I went to first, and then from Scrubs I went on to Onley, and then from there I was in Hollesey Bay, which is the open prison.
And what happens now? What happens to you now? You come out. What have you got in your pocket, and where do you go?
Right now, I've been to probation.
Yes.
I've seen my probation worker, and then from there, I have to go home. I have to be home at 3 o'clock onwards until tomorrow morning, so to get my tag fitted. But they said to me that there's pretty much no chance of me getting it today. I know people that have waited 4 weeks
for their tag.
Yeah.
So you haven't got your tag yet.
No.
So there's no way that they can check whether you are actually at home from 3 o'clock until tomorrow. But
if
they could come round. They could come, and will they? Do they?
Yeah, it's half a dozen to one of the other, really.
Yeah, well, it's not a risk worth taking, Ryan, as I'm sure.
No, not at all. No,
as I'm sure you appreciate.
No, I'm not going to do that.
But if you did, so it's another example. So they haven't given you a tag yet. You might wait weeks for it. If they did establish that you weren't observing the terms of your curfew, that you would go back. And I mean, so again, a lot of people listening to this would presume that for you to be recalled, you would have to commit a crime. But actually, but you would break the terms of your license. I'm not saying you shouldn't be recalled for breaking the terms of your license. I'm just pointing out that it's not a crime in the traditional context of how we use the word.
No, so the license I signed today says on it, like, if I miss probation, which I have to do for the next 3 weeks once a week.
Right.
If I miss any appointments, you get a warning, and then you get another warning, and after that, you're on your third warning, which you will be recalled for just missing for missing. But it's not like they used to do a 28-day recall. It's a year now.
Gosh. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that explains part of the overcrowding problem as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, the prisons are well overcrowded. Like when I was in Onley, we was out for a couple of hours a day. And this is a C-Cat prison, and I was out more when I was in a B-Cat prison.
And are you determined to stay out of jail?
100%. Like, there's no things. I didn't even need to do what I did.
What did you do?
I don't even know. I was selling drugs.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was just an idiot. I can't even put any other words to it.
No, fair enough. And you'll be able. You've got a plan for supporting yourself and stuff like that.
Yes, I do. I'm lucky. I've got a thing, but I know like family around me and stuff like that.
Yes.
But again, I know people that have been released with nothing. Homeless people have been released from prison. They're like drug addicts and stuff like that. That are homeless.
They'll be back by tea time.
Yeah, 100%. Like, and they have nothing in place for these people. It's like where we were talking yesterday about setting up people doing community orders and stuff like that. They're still not going to fix things because you can't send somebody that's got a heroin problem or a drug problem to go and work in a charity shop.
No.
You need to put these people in the places where they actually get help.
They've got to get clean before they can do any community centre.
Yeah, it's like even when I was in Scrubs and I worked on what's called the IDTS landing, which is for people who are on the methadone and all of that.
Yes.
And you see these people they're not getting any help because they're giving them extra strength to keep them going, so they don't cold turkey and stuff like that. Yeah, okay. And then if they're not doing that, they're smoking spice.
Ooh.
And it's just ridiculous, and the officers do nothing about it.
Because it makes their life easier to have people who are semi-comatose on spice.
Oh yeah, they just freeze.
Was that your first time inside?
It's my first, yeah.
And it's turned you. You're not going.
No, I'm not saying it was a hard time for me that I had in there because I went in there with a sense, well, I'm coming in on my own, I'm leaving on my own.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna argue with people.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna argue with the officers. Just kept my head down and got on with it. Like I had quite an easy ride, to say the least. Like,
I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you. One thing I do want to ask you. You got out of jail at 8 o'clock this morning, and you've already tuned in to me.
Yeah, you were the first person I tuned into.
That's terrifying, mate.
I was working every day anyway, so when I was driving off to work, I'd listen to you on the way into work.
That's nice. Well, allow me to wish you the best of luck then, Ryan, and keep your nose clean, mate.
All right, then. Thank you very much.
All right, you mind how you go?
Cheers.
12:34 is the time. Amelia Cox has the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:37. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I have a book in front of me that it will stop you in your tracks if you're not already aware of its existence and your literary enthusiasms are anything like mine. It is a new John le Carré novel, sort of. It's called Carla's Choice, which again aficionados will be familiar with the origins of, and it is written by Nick Harkaway, who joins me now.
Hello.
You've got three names potentially, haven't you? Because I'm a big John le Carré fan, so I know that his real name was David Cornwell. You are his son, and you are writing under the name of neither le Carré nor Cornwell.
That's right. Well, I could have done Cornwell when I started writing, but then Bernard and Patricia kind of own that section of the bookshelf, and I just thought I'll disappear forever.
So you were like one of those actors who discovers that somebody else has already got an equity card, and you elected to...
Yes.
So where does Harkaway come from then?
I stuck a pin in Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable.
Did you? Yeah. It's a lovely name.
Isn't it?
Yes,
I know, I
really
was quite
is.
envious.
Yeah, well. And you, of course, are an author in your own right, and of some repute. So why, how, when did you decide to go after your dad's unfinished manuscript?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, in retrospect, it seems to me I must have been out of my mind. But it's going very well. My brother Simon asked me.
I saw a headline in the Daily Telegraph. It is this new le Carré novel even better than The Master. You couldn't have written that yourself with a straight face.
No, I actually feel slightly kind of uncertain about that. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with it.
No, but so your brother, you knew you had the basis of the book.
No, I mean, so he left us kind of little bits of stuff, but actually this doesn't include any of the things he left behind.
It's entirely
It's entirely of itself. It does begin with an incident in the real world of espionage that he loved as a story.
Yes.
And which he told kind of, for fun, and sort of always wanted to put into a book. And there are a couple of other things like that in there. But no, it's of whole cloth.
And how did you sort of gird your loins to do it? Because other people have stepped up to the plate of carrying on incredibly successful
and it's hard
literary franchises.
Yeah.
So Sherlock Holmes, James Bond, but I don't think anyone's son or daughter has ever really done it before.
So I reread all the Smiley books, and I kind of gave my brain over to them completely. But what I found was, I realised that I grew up in the 70s. I was born in 72, and he was writing the books then, and he read the books as he was writing them to my mum over the breakfast table every morning. So during the years where I was learning how to speak, I was getting about 90 minutes of Smiley every day.
Wow.
So
before
when
anyone knew what an audio book was.
Exactly. So when I came to do it, it was right there waiting.
And did it feel like fate?
It felt like the apprenticeship I've always wanted with him, because we never really talked about writing. I sort of saw him do it, but we never had a kind of, this is how you do it conversation. Yes. And it felt like sort of some form of unity with him, which I wanted.
Yes, I was going to say, did it make you feel closer to him? But you've sort of answered that question already. Lost him in December of 2020,
yes,
of course. You'll never know what he thinks of the book itself. What do you think he would have thought of the idea of you writing a Smiley novel?
So I know what he'd ask me.
Go on.
He'd say, do you know creatively why you're doing it?
Ah.
And the answer is yes, I want that apprenticeship. I'm learning. I learnt a lot writing this. If I do more, I'll learn more from him in a way that you can only do if you step into their shoes.
So what did you want creatively?
I wanted that apprenticeship. I wanted to learn. Because we, as I say, we never talked about writing on the nose. Like very occasionally we did. But I felt like I could get something from this that would teach me to be a better writer. And I'm sure I have.
It's an extraordinary roll call of praise on the back page. William Boyd, Margaret Atwood, Ian Rankin, David McCloskey, Tony Parsons, Scott Mariani, Helen MacDonald, and of course Mick Herron, who many people see as something of a successor to you or an inheritor of your father's mantle as the king of espionage literature. For fans of espionage literature, what do you do with Smiley?
What do you do?
What do you do with him?
What do I do?
Yes. What have you done with him?
I've told another Smiley story. I've gone into, just after The Spy Came In From the Cold and before Tinker Tailor, there's a 9-year gap. So you've got space to tell stories that belong to themselves, that aren't just infill. They're new and yet of the universe. And so I've told the story of Smiley after Spy Came From the Cold, very angry with what's happened, basically quitting and being happy, which is not something we associate with him. And he's got the possibility of another life, and then he gets asked to do a very simple, ordinary debrief of somebody and is sucked back in quite intentionally by Control to come back to the circus.
And you would need to be completely immersed in the universe that your father created in order to tread so deftly through that sort of territory.
Thank you.
And well, readers are as well, of course. And that would be one of the things you were conscious of, was the idea of somehow diminishing the legacy.
Terrified of it. And I mean, the whole process was scary in a completely new way. Usually when I write a book, my question to myself is anyone going to follow on this mad trajectory, whatever I've done? Because I never saw two genres I didn't want to blow up and smash together. And so the question is, will they come with me? And this time, everybody's there waiting. And the question is, can I bring, what they want? Can I deliver? That's a new kind of scary.
It's a beautiful dedication because it is dedicated to David John Moore Cornwell, father, husband, brother, son, ping pong player, cartoonist, wine drinker, dog walker, Germanist, Francophile, lost boy, late life Irishman. That was Brexit related, I think, wasn't it?
It was, although it became a really serious emotional journey for him because Ireland said yes to him.
Yes.
Just because of his family, and he didn't ask anything in exchange.
And terrible cook. And then the second
second
part of the dedication is simply to John le Carré, novelist, and that speaks to the duality of his existence, but also to how little of the father was the novelist. I mean, to you, he's dad. To the rest of us, he's John le Carré.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, and the novelist was also the father. The division isn't absolute, but. Yeah, I see a very different thing when I think of him.
Do you think you'll do more?
If it goes well.
Yeah, well, it's already going pretty well.
It's going pretty well,
as we've established.
I sort of got that answer to that question from before the weekend.
Okay, no, fair enough. And finally, you might not know this. You probably do. And of course. Quite a lot has emerged about your dad but while he was alive and subsequently. But when I was on a newspaper journalist, one thing I was very bad at was knowing the names that would see the eyebrows of editors rise. So, it was quite a weird thing to predict. So George Michael, for example, I would have been fairly confident if I had a story involving George Michael that everyone would be interested. But your dad was in that unique space, is that a certain type of journalist, whenever that name was mentioned, they'd be interested in whatever the story was.
Yeah. It's a strange thing.
It really is a strange thing.
And it's only now, really, in my 50s, that I realise how odd the life that I inhabited when I was living with my parents was.
Yes.
And people are asking me at the moment when I'm doing book events and so on, what was it like? And I don't know, because I don't know what it was like to be anybody else's kid.
This comes up a lot in my Full Disclosure series. You only have one childhood, and it's the only childhood you ever know. But I know Mick quite well, for instance. I got Mick Herron, and no one's remotely interested in anything that he does. I'd say it's great relief,
I was going to say, I think that's a great relief. He's a very nice man.
Yes, and a brilliant writer, as indeed are you, Nick Harkaway. Carla's Choice, which, I mean, I should stress, it stands alone. Yes. You might have needed to read the entire canon to write it, but you certainly don't need to read the entire canon to read it or to enjoy it. It is a self-contained espionage thriller.
Yes, that's definitely the idea, yeah.
Thank you. I look forward to the next one, which I think we can be fairly confident you'll be having. If not, your publisher will be cracking whips outside your front door at the first opportunity. Thank you very much indeed, Nick Harkaway. Carla's Choice is out now.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:49 is the time. It's one of those Wednesdays where we get very literary because I have another book to bring to your attention next. A few of you pointing out Christopher Tolkien also stepped into the breach vacated by his, I was going to say inimitable, but that's probably not the right word to use in the context of Nick Harkaway's splendid new book. And I turn your attention next to Peter York's splendid new book. It's called A Dead Cat on Your Table, and Peter joins me now. It is it's a book that is, for regular listeners to this programme, probably going to prove quite close to their hearts, because it can sometimes be a lonely business, Peter, chronicling what some of us see as a very deliberate assault upon values and ideas that, even from a patriotic perspective, we used to hold very dear. So what is the purpose of a dead cat on your table?
The purpose of a dead cat on the table is described in the epigram by Mr. Johnson, one of our former Prime Ministers. And he's talking about Sir Linton Crosby, the political campaigner, American-Australian. And he says broadly that what matters here, there's one thing that's absolutely certain about throwing a dead cat on the dining room table, and I don't mean that people will be outraged, alarmed, disgusted. That is true, but irrelevant. The key point, says my Australian friend, is that everyone will shout, "Geez, mate, there's a dead cat on the table." In other words, they will be talking about the dead cat, the thing you want them to talk about, and they will not be talking about the issue that's been causing you so much grief.
I'd forgotten that quote, and this light comes on every day, Peter, and the when it first comes on, there are 3 hours stretching out in front of us like a yellow brick road of pontification. But I found myself occasionally during Johnson's pomp thinking that we were overthinking things when we suggested that there were dead cats, that it wasn't actually a deliberate policy of distraction. And it stopped me in my tracks when I had an early look at this book to be reminded that not only was the dead cat very much part of the armoury, but he did what he often does and sort of suffering from a form of verbal incontinence in a way. And he actually said it all. He said it all out loud. So how does that lead to an entire book?
It leads to an entire book because there's an entire call of people who do culture wars. They do it as a job. They do it every day. They get into offices in Westminster, just round the school and Parliament, and they work all day. They work in lobbyists and quotes unquote think tanks, opaquely funded think tanks. There are unopaquely funded think tanks.
There are. It's a shame that we use the same phrase to describe them, isn't it, in many ways?
But it is a shame because there are people who do real original research and then punt it up. But if you do that, you don't get as much money as an opaquely punted think tank that lobbyists call wonk whores.
Yes. Do they?
They
That's
call
a good
them
phrase.
wonk whores. It's a great phrase, isn't it?
Yes, because it means that if you pays the price, you can miraculously be presented with research that fits precisely the political agenda you're seeking to pursue.
Unfortunately for them, there exists a film done by Greenpeace undercover in the IEA offices where I think it was Mark Littlewood revealed that if you pay for some market right research, you might get something you wanted in terms of a report. And then somebody tremendously smart, who is called a fellow or something like that. These aren't, in any sense, academic institutions, goes to his friends in government and pushes the point that you've bought. And he goes to his friends in media. Remember, between 80 and 90% of Britain's national newspapers have a distinct right-wing leaning, a distinct and permanent right-wing leaning.
What is the purpose of the culture war, the broadest purpose?
The broadest purpose of the culture wars is to get your way. If you have a tremendous financial or political vested interest, and culture wars were invented broadly by Americans in K Street, Washington, which is where all the lobbyists live. The lobbyists who work for the incredibly rich corporations, organisations and individuals now, because billionaires are big in politics now.
We've seen that with Elon Musk. So it is about persuading, doing two things, getting governments to do what you want, and also persuading populations that they want what you want, even though what they want is against your own interests. So which is the great triumph of the last 20 years in the United Kingdom, is encouraging people to vote for things that are against their own interests.
Absolutely. And it's classic stuff. It's not newly invented, but it's been supercharged and super accelerated by the internet.
I mean, it's an extraordinary compendium because you look at individuals. There is sometimes a certain. We were talking earlier about how well Angela Rayner and Oliver Dowden were getting on at PMQs, and this sort of outbreak of bonhomie. You're not shy of naming names, are you? The people in the media, the people in the so-called. Well, there's the second half of the book is actually called Places and People. The first half of the book also contains the names of people like Farage and Russell Brand comes in for quite forensic scrutiny, and then the addresses that listeners to this programme will be familiar with, most obviously, of course, Tufton Street, Lord North Street, just round the corner. And you go after journalists as well, you name them. It struck me, so I've known you for some time, and I think that I first encountered you when you were responsible for the Sloane Ranger Handbook, which was an extraordinarily successful volume and also zeitgeist, really. You defined it. And
I did that stuff.
I only realised reading this, well, I presume reading this, that quite a lot of your interest in what you've just been describing comes from your background in
market research.
What you would call proper market research.
Proper market research.
As in genuinely trying to find out what people think.
And market segmentation.
Yes.
Who's in the market for what, and what do you say to them?
And that's what you break down here. Who's in the market for what, and what is being said to them. I enjoyed the 5 characters. Should we run quickly through the 5 characters you've identified as sort of key players in the modern culture? Was the fogey historian. Now, I've talked a lot about this, the people who actually paint
traditional values.
Well, yes, except they don't like history.
But they don't like history.
Historians
who
don't like history
their way.
Yes.
So they bring a lot of baggage to their version of history.
Martin Rowson's cartoons pepper the book, punctuate the
brilliant.
book, and that's possibly one of my favourites.
There's
the
a
Tory
brilliant
boys.
one of Liz Truss in
Yes,
front of the
a little
IEA.
one outside the IEA's
Tiny,
office.
shouting
Tiny
Liz
little
Truss.
Liz Truss. What's the second one? What are the Tory boys with a Z?
The Tory boys with a Z are those young, but not really young, old before their time, young people who work as spads, who work in the think tanks, who work in that world. And they always have specs, and they mostly wear suits.
There's so many of them. And a lot of them ended up in government, of course, under Liz Truss. And the revolving door now is getting ridiculous. Are you thinking what she's thinking?
That's there's a particular columnist. There's a whole group of very middle class women who appeal, presumably, to other middle class women.
Yes.
Who say, "Are you thinking what she's thinking?" And it all started back in the middle class, in the middling tabloids 50 years ago.
It was sort of women with jobs having a swing at women with jobs, wasn't it? There
exactly
was a sort of irony to the Linda Lee Potter School of Journalism.
Linda Lee Potter, you've got it in one.
And then we have the illiberal Kerry. What's that?
Illiberal Kerry is somebody who talks about herself as being of the left.
I know who this is, but I can tell from the picture.
Yeah, does nothing but...
Yes, sorry.
It's very, Martin's pictures are brilliant.
Leave little doubt as to who is being talked about here. People who profess to be of the left, but have actually become tools of the right.
And go on to platforms which are of the right, and attack initiatives and people which are of the right.
They could perhaps be passionate opponents of the House of Lords, say, and end up in it.
And then end up in it.
I perish the thought. And finally, Sloane and Colonial. Given that you essentially own Sloane, this is a particularly interesting...
It's how old-fashioned are you? How retro? Are you 50 years retro or 100 years retro? And a colonial background is a great help in this.
So what it does is join the dots.
It joins the dots.
And has a lot of fun in the process. It's not remote. It's not in danger of being po-faced or patronising or condescending. It's very, very funny, but it's also richly, richly detailed.
All this happens pretty much in Westminster.
Yeah.
If you were a real person and you lived in Rotherham or Rutherglen, you wouldn't be bothered with any of this. But these people are bothered with you.
They are, and they are dedicated to the mission of persuading you to vote against your own interest. A Dead Cat on Your Table by Peter York, with illustrations by Martin Rowson, is published by Byline and is out now, and it is just brill. It really is. Go to deadcatonyourtable.com to find out more, or go to your local bookshop and pop it in your basket. Peter, always a pleasure. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
That's it from me for another day. We'll do it all again tomorrow from 10. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player. where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. So download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.
Thanks very much indeed, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.